Chapter 1978. A few days later, the Five Flowers Immortal Mountain slowly entered the center of the interior realm and started to slowly rotate. Its aura became high and mysterious. In everyone's eyes, the Five Flowers Immortal Mountain seemed to have turned into a huge furnace, burning fiercely. This wasn't a real burning, but it was better than a real burning. They thought that if it really burned, it wouldn't be able to burn the souls of the spectating cultivators. However, this kind of burning of the cultivators' consciousness seemed to be able to burn everything. The closer they got, the more they could feel the pressure of burning everything. However, none of the half-immortals retreated. This was the reason why the half-immortals of the interior realm were keen on watching the Immortal World announcements. Even if they knew that this kind of process of ascending to immortality wasn't something they would experience in the future, during this kind of process, that kind of feeling of floating in the air was truly unstoppable. During this process, they could see the senior immortals fighting against the heavens for longevity, fighting against nature for spring. After going through untold hardships, they strived with all their might and broke through the limits of human freedom. All living things competed for freedom under the frost sky. It was a kind of transformation of the body, a sublimation of the spirit, and a fusion of the Tao realm with the laws. How could a mere furnace's fire burn away the hearts of the half-immortals that surged more than the fire? Raging fire, burn my ruined body. This furnace's triple quenching has a hint of heresy and evil. I'm guessing that immortal Wu Hua's triple quenching probably couldn't do without some kind of ceremony of unity. A large-scale burning heaven assembly can play an important role in his self-forging. She was very sharp. When the Immortal World announcement started, he had a fairly accurate judgment of immortal Wu Hua's ancient method. Qing Xian smiled. In the ancient times, it wasn't new to gather people to burn fire to worship the heavens. There was even a realm where all the cultivators raised a fire together to send the ancestor to immortality. However, that was in the ancient times. It's impossible now. No one can use the sacrifice of thousands of cultivators to achieve their own goals. It's true that it's an evil sect now, but it might not be in the ancient times. Therefore, this method can't be passed down. The price is too great. They were far away, so their perception of the Five Flowers Immortal Mountain was still superficial. They could only say that it was sour and salty, like grapes that couldn't be eaten. Smokey curled his lips and said, "Senior brothers, you were already full of bad ideas when you gave the position away. Now that it's really started, you're starting to be jealous. You must be feeling uncomfortable seeing someone so close to the immortal sign, right?" Qing Xian sneered, "Just watch. Was it so easy to take advantage of him? I have a feeling that something is going to happen during the Immortals announcement this time." It was rare for Shi Yu to agree. Senior apprentice brother is right. As the saying goes, fortune and misfortune go hand in hand. The Five Flowers Immortal Mountains were still undergoing drastic changes. The flames of cultivators burned the heavens and scorched the earth. The entire Five Splendors celestial mountain was surrounded by a layer of light. Vaguely, the Tao realms within changed in a myriad of ways, and it displayed the ability of the five cosmoses to evolve. This was the pinnacle attainment of an immortal in the five great realms. Among the half-immortals here, very few were proficient in all five great realms, but the bamboo hat was a special one. He had a special opportunity, and his understanding of the Tao realms was the same as Lu Xiaoi's. He had already kept up with the rhythm of the collapse of the great Tao, and even surpassed Lu Xiaoi's. This was because he was also very proficient in nirvana. Only he could barely keep up with the rhythm of immortal elder Wu Hua's burning of himself, and learn from it to perfect his already deep understanding of the Tao realms. This kind of realization made some kind of connection between him and the burning Five Flowers Immortal Mountains, and they began to synchronize. The Tao realms were synchronized, and the flames were also synchronized. In the eyes of the other half-immortals, it was as if the flames of the Five Flowers Immortal Mountains were extending outwards, but it was only burning the bamboo hat. This was the first time in the history of the interior realm. The immortal sign was just a sign, a kind of replay of what had happened in the past, and it did not really exist. Then, how could it be connected with the half-immortals who were watching? This completely violated the principle of the energy balance of cultivation. In everyone's surprise, the flames on the bamboo hat became more and more intense, and soon became the same as the 5 flowers immortal mountains, becoming 2 bright balls in everyone's perception. What? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Look at what the 2 of you have done. This bamboo hat will either be destroyed by the flames and die, or he will take a step further, and this great opportunity will be caught by him. The 2 of you, including little E, have misjudged. She became even more jealous. I can't see clearly. It should be a resonance with immortal elder Wu Hua's Grandao of the 5 flowers. There are 2 questions here. Can the immortal sign be extended? If this guy gets something, then someone will definitely lose something. If it's not us who are watching the show, then who can it be? The Grandao of the 5 flowers has already collapsed, and their resonance of the Dao realms actually has no theoretical basis. If this continues, what will happen? No one answered, but everyone had an answer in their hearts, and the answer was unexpectedly the same. You do let out a long breath. Is this killing the immortals? Or is it the legacy of the immortals after they die? Qing Xian's expression was grim, and he also realized something. It could be said that his little plan seemed to have become someone else's ladder. In the 2,000 years of cultivation and planning, this was the first time he had made a major mistake. Although the results were theoretically both good and bad, he had a bad premonition. It was very likely that he had been taken advantage of. If there is an immortal death, then there must have been a sign. When the 5 flowers immortal mountain began to fly towards the center, the fate of immortal Wu Hua was already decided. The current performance is only the last glory of immortal Wu Hua. Of course, it could also be his resistance. If the bamboo hat gets involved, it will speed up the process of the immortal death, because immortal Wu Hua's understanding of the Grand Tao is not completely the same as that of a newcomer like the bamboo hat. Normally, immortal Wu Hua's Grand Tao realm is purer and more authentic, but now, the universe has changed, and the Grand Tao has collapsed, so the unlucky one can only be immortal Wu Hua. He is hopeless. Now the question is, how much can this bamboo hat get from it? When an immortal falls, there will naturally be a legacy of fate. There are also many mysterious and unspeakable things that will dissipate and spread to the universe. Most of them will disappear, but some will be found by a lucky person, and that is a great opportunity. Bei Feng suddenly spoke up. If senior brother Liu was here, sitting in that position, would such an opportunity be his? Smokey shook his head, resolutely and decisively. No. If little E is here, he will do his best to help immortal Wu Hua fight for his last chance of survival. He will not care about what he can get from it. As for this bamboo hat, it looks like he is cooperating with the resonance, but in fact, he is leading it to the real situation. He does not have good intentions. Chi Fan sighed. It is still senior brother Liu who is righteous. Smokey curled his lips. Righteous my ass. He wants to take in a little brother in the immortal world. As for why he doesn't want to take advantage of it, the reason is very simple. He doesn't care about the legacy of an unknown, ordinary immortal. Qing Xin laughed. Liu often says that the one who gives birth to him is his parents, but the one who knows him is his senior sister. These words are not false. That fellow's thoughts have been seen through by senior sister. Chapter 1979. The onlookers were no longer watching a show, but watching the struggle of an immortal. What Qing Xian and Yin Chuan could understand. How could the old guys here not understand? They were all old demons of several thousand years, and there were more than a few seconds severance. Their judgment of the situation could only be more precise and profound, but no one would interfere. This was not only a rule, but also a taboo. Was it so fun to casually interfere in the process of an immortal's fall? Unless your knowledge of the 5th Grand was above that of the bamboo hat, don't even think about it. Immortals would die, and it was hard to say for the bamboo hat, but those who interfered now would definitely not have a good ending. This was the insight that every half-immortal had to have. They could only watch, appreciate, and comprehend such a rare process of an immortal's fall. This was a completely new experience for everyone. But what they weren't sure was, would there be more and more such experiences in the future? Everyone was thinking that since the interior heaven, cultivators who could truly take a step forward by observing the announcement of the immortal world were rare. Then, could they also think that this kind of announcement of the immortal world itself had no meaning to their upper level? What was meaningful was the fall of the immortal world, which had more practical effects. As long as your knowledge of the Tao realm matched that of the immortal world, it might be very dangerous, and they might die along with the immortal, but compared to what could be gained from it, what was this kind of danger? The result of all this would depend on the final performance of this half-immortal freak. Thus, no one stopped them from harassing him. They couldn't and weren't willing. 5 Flowers Celestial Mountain, after a short period of equilibrium, began to become unstable. This was expected because the 5th Grand had already collapsed, and many things that deity Wu Hua had once relied on as a cornerstone had already changed. When the bamboo hat followed this change, it was also the beginning of deity Wu Hua's collapse. The bamboo hat's actual situation was not as easy as he appeared. The one who was connected to him was a genuine immortal, an existence that he had never come into contact with before. But riches and honor came from danger. He understood this principle from the first day he started cultivating. Why did he come here? He was not as lost and ignorant as others thought. He was very clear about the little tricks of Buddhism and Taoism behind his back. It was just that his performance was like a little white rabbit. But this little white rabbit of his had fangs. Marching monks are pretentious, hypocritical, and have great ambition but little talent. Ma Bailu, a fly that seeks personal gain, a fox that exploits the tiger's might, a hypocrite. Neither of them was a good person. She was holding back her evil intentions towards him. He accepted it all, because what he loved the most was to turn the tables in a hopeless situation. Since the day he started cultivating, it had been his only weapon against his enemies. So what if he came from a powerful background? Arrogant, conceited, and self-righteous. Did he think that he could run amok in the universe just because he was born into a good family? The higher one's realm was, the more they had to look at themselves. He looked down on these two people. In his mind, there was only one person in interior realm that he was really afraid of, and that was the mysterious Lu Xiaoyi. Lu Xiaoyi, thick-skinned and shameless, hiding a dagger in his smile, swindling others, saying one thing and thinking another, two-faced and full of evil. Although this position originally belonged to Lu Xiaoyi, now that he had taken it, he was not grateful at all, because this was a trap to harm him. Lu Xiaoyi might not have known, but this indifference made him even angrier. Did he think that because he picked up something he didn't want, he was inferior to others? When he really achieved something, he would make these so-called noble people regret it. Deity Wu Hua could not escape this calamity. He was in the burning Tao state of the deity Wu Hua, so he could clearly feel this. This was the inevitable result after the collapse of the 5 ties. All the immortals who used the Tao state of the 5 ties as their foundation were among them. It was just a matter of time. Persimmons had to be pinched softly, and the heavenly Tao was the same. Deity Wu Hua, who had the weakest cultivation, was such an unlucky person. In the process of the collapse of the universe, under the accumulation of the dissipation of the great Tao, his cultivation was at the bottom. His Tao state was the fusion of the 5 ties to form the postnatal nourishing Earth Great Tao. Under the rapid and continuous collapse, his Tao foundation was finally damaged. After persisting for hundreds of years, he still could not escape this calamity. With or without his bamboo hat, it was already set in stone that he would stick the pole in the end. On this point, it was already destined when deity Wu Hua began to move towards the center of the interior realm. This meant that somewhere in the 4 sacred heavens of the immortal court, deity Wu Hua began to use the body of Tao. There was a mysterious connection in the unseen world. In order to pay respect to this immortal, the interior realm had the shift of the celestial mountain. When the bamboo hat used his knowledge of the five ties to resonate with deity Wu Hua, he understood this clearly. Therefore, he did not feel any guilt and also knew that he would not have any karma because of this. He thanked Marching Monk for giving him this opportunity with ill intentions. He thanked Ma Bailu for his hypocritical half-heartedness. When they saw that he had this opportunity, their intestines would turn green with regret, right? He felt endless heat in his body, as if his spirit was burning. This was the mischief of deity Wu Hua's ancient method of immortal ascension. The furnace was quenched 3 times. The immortals showed that this was the 3rd quenching, and it was also the most thorough burning. If the bamboo hat wanted to gain something from it, he had to bear the pressure at the same time. This was not what deity Wu Hua wanted to give him. It was impossible for him to only receive benefits and not bear the pain. Even if it was extremely dangerous and he had a slim chance of survival, he had to endure it. This would open up a whole new world for his future. In the distance, the few people watching were somewhat dejected. Yudu asked, if this bamboo hat can endure it, do you think he will become a young god? Or another step to become a second severance? Seeing that everyone was looking at him, Qing Xian had already returned to his usual calmness. He was still waving his fan, but if he knew about the bamboo hat's evaluation of him, would he still be so calm? He will be a second severance. He has only just advanced to the primordial spirit realm, and his foundation is not enough. On the ancient method of immortal ascension, one walked on 2 legs. One was Yin God, primordial spirit, and Yang God, and the other was 1 step, 2 steps, and 3 steps. Under normal circumstances, one would first walk the path of Yang God. But in this chaotic universe, under the chaotic heavenly Tao, everything was chaotic. Bei Feng clicked his tongue. 1 step for Yin God, 2 steps for primordial spirit. Then doesn't that mean that when he reaches Yang God, he will directly become an immortal in 3 steps? If I remember correctly, this should be the fastest speed to become an immortal in the history of the cultivation world, right? Qi Fan smiled. It is indeed so in the history of the modern cultivation world, but does not include the ancient and ancient times. At that time, there were people who succeeded in becoming an immortal in 1,000 years. Even in the recent ancient times, there were people who did it within 2,000 years. Shi humphed. I have only heard of cultivators who live longer than others, but I have never heard of anyone who lived faster. The king of hell likes to be in such a hurry to reincarnate. Chapter 1980. Amidst everyone's astonishment, a miracle happened before their eyes. They personally witnessed the fall of a celestial and the birth of a second severance freak. Miracles were often like this. There would be more occurrences in the first and last time, and then countless people would chase after them. Then, would this kind of transformation of the interior heaven become the mainstream method of upper realms in the future? This was what many half-celestials really want to know. The 5 flowers celestial mountain gradually collapsed in the burning. This was a true collapse, but what collapsed was not the substance, but what was originally inside the celestial mountain. From a celestial to a mortal, from prosperity to decline. If the interior heaven would still exist for a very long time, the 5 flowers celestial mountain that had lost its celestial lattice could be absorbed by other celestial wonders in the long passage of time, and finally disappear. This was the erasure of traces. The 5 flowers celestial mountain would not be the only one. It only represented a beginning. Next, there would be even more celestial wonders falling into the mortal world. But what had to be noted was that the existence that would be erased was only the celestial wonders of the interior heaven. It itself was a kind of projection of great power, and when the great power was no longer present, the projection would naturally disappear. But in reality, the realm where this celestial elder 5 flowers was famous, the famous celestial mountain, would not be affected too much. This was the difference between reality and projection. In the end, the interior heaven was a scene that had been created. It was far more affected by the changes of the universe than its actual existence. The line of silent words, was this going to rise? Half celestials began to disperse. The announcement of celestial wonders this time brought a very big impact to everyone, and they needed to go back and digest it and think about the future. Celestials would fall when the foundation of great Tao was no longer there, which meant that the changes of the universe had already entered a new stage. More and more strange phenomena showed that the change of the era was approaching, and it was not like what many people thought, invisible and untouchable, as if it was still very far away. Qing Xian and the others also began to leave. There was no way to watch. The more they watched, the more stifled they felt. The disgusting people who had failed once thought that they were lifting others up high, but in reality, they were being lifted up by others. When they pulled out the ladder, they realized that they had already lifted others up to the clouds and could no longer fall down. Smoke Puppet pondered, is this good? In spirit first severance, primordial spirit second severance? Our cultivation philosophy has always told us that we shouldn't have too many opportunities in key positions. Once is enough. If you overdo it, the wound will grow. When you treat all of this as normal, it will be the moment when everything collapses. Little E seems to have said something. What was it again? Qing Xian continued. If you walk too fast, you'll pull your balls. The others laughed. Shiyu explained, this sentence actually means that Qian Xiu can't walk too fast, but Kuan Xiu can. Qing Xian glared at them and admitted, we didn't do a good job in this matter. It's all my fault. He thinks he's infallible, thinking that he can control people in the palm of his hand. In fact, this guy knows everything and is just playing dumb with us. But I still have to say that in the short term, we are the losers. But in the long term, that might not be the case. Shiyu agreed. Senior brother is right. The first slash of Einsoul did not have much of an impact on a cultivator's cultivation. One could still advance bravely before the end of the epic. There was no need to deliberately control it. However, second severance, primordial divinity transformation, was a problem. Then, how will you control the direction of your cultivation from now on? You won't be able to advance bravely anymore. Because if you advance too fast, or if another opportunity comes, when you can take the third step, you will find that you are still a primordial spirit, and your foundation is not solid. When the opportunity comes, you can't reject it. Otherwise, it will never come again. The situation of the universe determines that every cultivator has to follow the general trend. You can't look left and right and deliberately stop. You can't stop, but you're afraid of rushing too fast. The process of controlling it is very weak because you can't change the course of the universe. The only way is to reach the yang spirit as soon as possible. But is it so easy to reach the yang spirit? It's different from stepping into an epiphany. It takes time. So I think that our raising may not be ineffective. It's just that this effect may come very slowly. In the beginning, it may even help the enemy. But it doesn't matter. It's better to look at things in the long term. This was a penetrating insight. It originated from the foundation of the orthodox Taoist forces. It explained a principle. Even in such a fast cultivation speed, rhythm was a crucial part. Chaos was relative. Yin spirit, primordial spirit, and yang spirit. 1 step, 2 steps, and 3 steps could be interspersed, but it couldn't deny its basic rules. Otherwise, it would be very easy to go astray. If too much time was wasted on breaking through to the yang spirit, you might lose the time to step into an epiphany. Too fast a step, and a weak foundation would definitely affect the last step of immortal ascension. Qing Xian and the others raising high affected the rhythm of the bamboo hat. Under completely unexpected circumstances, they raised him to the second severance. Qing Xian said calmly, don't be anxious. Our raising high hasn't ended yet. We've only raised it halfway. So how did it fail? Everyone put in more effort and try to raise him to the third severance as soon as possible. I've always been very curious. If a primordial spirit reached the third severance, what kind of new thing would he come up with? Everyone laughed, and only Yin Xian was unhappy. Why do you have to play tricks? If you don't like it, why don't you just fight it out? North Wind spoke the truth. Let's see who's the real deal. That's Senior Brother Lu's business. As for us, it's more fun to raise each other. This was the rule of the cultivation world. In terms of cause and effect, this was Lu Xiaoyi's own matter. It was not suitable for others to stand up for him. Furthermore, how many people here dare to say that they could deal with a second Severance half-immortal? If he did not find a chance to deal with them, they would be considered merciful. From afar, they saw the marching monk and a few other monks walking together, and everyone nodded in greeting. The marching monk put on a fake smile. Congratulations, freak of Taoism. Another genius has appeared. Qing Xian put on a fake smile. Congratulations to you too. Without Grandmaster's support, how could he have such a chance? Both sides brushed past each other, each disdainful. This was the current situation of the interior heaven. Qing Xian looked at his friends. I've been cultivating in the interior heaven for 200 to 300 years now. After a long period of silence, I think it's time to go down and take a look. There's no need to say goodbye. The universe is turbulent, and we'll meet sooner or later. I hope that at that time, we'll have the chance to walk together. Everyone silently returned the greeting. In truth, everyone knew that the change of the five splendors, celestial mountains, was a shock to everyone. It meant that the change was accelerating. They would no longer use the calculation method of one Tao collapsing every few hundred years to estimate the time of the change of epochs. With the collective collapse of the five cosmoses, the collapse of the great Tao would most likely follow closely behind. There was not much time left. Qing Xian had noticed and went down to find his own fated chance. Whether it was Young God or Second Severance, it was all a response to the change. They were the same. Their situations were different, but their goal was the same. Just like Lu Xiaoyi, who did not know the interior heaven at all. Had he already predicted this kind of change? Chapter 1981. Lu Xiaoyi wandered in the space of the small Sumeru realm, as if he had really become a monk. In these 100 years, it had played a crucial role in his growth in the Buddhist Tao realm. He did not care about the path of others, but he knew his own path very well. He had his own sources of information about the bamboo hat and the Wuhua celestial mountain in the interior realm. After hearing about it, he just laughed. Qing Xian and the others had gone too far, but everything was not settled yet. It was too early to talk about success or failure. Everyone's path was very special. He never envied others, and he did not regret if he was in the interior realm. That position was actually his. Just like what Yin Shan said, what was there to fight for in the Tao state of an immortal who was first eliminated by the heavenly Tao? He did not underestimate himself. That was his pride. It was also the goal he set for himself. All the masters of the immortals in the interior realm were man immortals and true immortals. There was not even a single golden immortal. He could not give up his own path for these ordinary immortals. To him, staying in the small Sumeru realm was obviously more important. Never underestimate others, and never underestimate yourself. This was his belief. For these great Buddhas who might never have the chance to take a step forward, they might be lacking in epiphany, but their deep accumulation in the Tao state of Buddhism was incomparable to any other Buddhist world in the universe. Not only was it profound, but it was also broad and inclusive. Here, he could find any senior monk in the Tao state without missing out. The issue of a swordsman having an academic exchange in a sacred place of Buddhism was not like what the ordinary people imagined. They were like water and fire, incompatible with each other. This was related to the level of the realm. The so-called exchange between different orthodoxies in the middle and lower realms was laughable. They were still immersed in the path of techniques and were far from Tao. But it was different when they reached the Yuanying level. They had the foundation to discuss Tao. However, it was the right of a half-immortal to go to a different realm and enter Buddhism alone. They had already broken through the shackles of the cultivation world of the main world and could discuss Tao as friends. They were no longer bound by the traditional rules and regulations. They were the highest level of cultivators that the cultivators of the origin world could come into contact with. Any higher, and the immortals would not come down to discuss the Tao with you. Therefore, this was actually a two-way exchange. Lu Xiaoyi could get what he wanted in the Buddhist Tao realm, but the great Buddhas of the origin world also had the opportunity to come into contact with the thoughts of a half-immortal. Just like how half-immortals longed to see immortals ascend to immortality, the great Buddhas also longed to communicate with half-immortals. Under such a premise, both sides were in different celestial spheres, and there was no direct threat of competition. The entire process of communication became natural, and there was little to hide. Lu Xiaoyi had also solidified the foundations of several Buddhist Tao realms in the past 100 years. He was only waiting for the shard of Tao to make the final upgrade. Not only did he come into contact with the Tao state of Buddhism, but he also came into contact with the life of Buddhism. This was determined by his unique philosophy. If you want to see all the 36 great Taos, you can't treat Buddhism as your enemy. Perhaps he could go against a certain monk or a certain Buddhist sect, but he could not go against the entire Buddhist sect. It was just like how he belonged to the Taoist sect, but he had killed many Taoists. He had to maintain a balance. The Taoist sect was the main sect, but the Buddhist sect was also indispensable. Now that he had completed the exchange of Tao realms in the small Sumeru realm, he could leave. Hands-free had gone to the interior heaven and would not be back for some time. He needed to bid farewell to these Buddhas. They might not be friends, but they could be called true Taoists. There is no need to draw a clear line between the great Tao and the primordial Tao. Only when you understood this would you have the breadth of mind to reach a higher level. Monk 9 Annihilation had a fat head and big ears. He looked like a Methriel Buddha. Lord Lu, you have been preaching in the small Sumeru realm for the past 100 years. You have broadened our horizons, and we have learned a lot. Now that we are parting, I can't believe you are reluctant to part. As a Taoist, you're the first person to make the small Sumeru realm feel this way. Lu Xiaoyi was very polite. The small Sumeru realm is indeed a Buddhist sacred world. I admire its open-minded attitude. Learning is mutual. How can there be such a thing as who teaches who? But the 100 years in the small Sumeru realm was the most peaceful time of my cultivation experience. As a swordsman, it is really surprising that there is such a peaceful environment in the Buddhist world. Monk 9 Annihilation laughed. It depends on the person. Not everyone can receive the same treatment as Lord Lu. What he said was right. Academic exchanges also had to be of equal value. If a Taoist who was proficient in the Taoist Tao realm came here, there wouldn't be much meaning in the exchange. You talked about virtues, I talked about the 5 elements, you talked about nirvana, I talked about slaughter, you talked about nirvana, I talked about thunder. It was like a chicken talking to a duck. Perhaps both sides would gain something, but they definitely wouldn't go too deep. This was because these were different great Tao systems, and there was no way to compare them. Lu Xiaoyi was different. He had his own direction of study in the Buddhist Tao realm. He had his own path of study in the Buddhist Tao realm. He had a deep understanding of karma, samsara, impermanence, and the other Buddhist Tao realms. Thus, he had the possibility of further study. And it was precisely because he was proficient in the Buddhist Tao realm that many great Buddhas were proficient in. This caused the monks of the small Sumeru realm to feel as if they were on the same path as him. You said that you had good intentions towards Buddhism, but why? How could they believe you? But if you were proficient in several Buddhist great Taos, then there was no need to say anything. The monks would naturally treat you as one of their own. The great Tao wouldn't lie. Once such a person ascended to a high position, his attitude towards Buddhism would definitely not be biased. Considering that the sword vein was also a Tao tradition that was suppressed and ostracized by the Taoist sect, very few people in the small Sumeru realm hid anything from him. This was a happy and honest exchange experience. This junior will remember this trip to the small Sumeru realm. If there is a chance in the future, perhaps there will be a chance for our two sects to work together. 9 Annihilation side. In the main world, this is all. Lord Lu, you have been here for 100 years. You should know that the small Sumeru realm's attitude towards the cultivation world is different from that of the great sage heavens. We have the same ideals and are in different celestial spheres. There won't be many chances for us to cross paths in the future. This old monk only hopes that when Lord Lu soars to the heavens in the future, you won't forget this experience in the small Sumeru realm. The Taoists and Buddhists are not all impenetrable walls. Living together is eternal. Fighting is venting. Once everyone is done venting, we will still have to live together. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This old monk was very insightful. He was also very precise about his own position. He did not ask for anything in return. He just wanted to form good karma. In the changing of eras, this kind of good karma was more important than anything else. This was not a paradise. There were all kinds of troubles. The reason why he did not ask for help was because he wanted to use this favor at the most critical moment. This was a true virtuous senior monk, not just for the small Sumeru realm, but for the entire Buddhist sect. But did he think too highly of Lu Xiaoyi? Chapter 1982. This was 100 years without any aftereffects. There were no battles, no troubles, and no promises. He came and went quietly, very much like a cultivator. The small Sumeru realm was a relatively pure Buddhist holy land. It was the mainstream ideology of the Buddhist sects in the current cultivation world. To be fair, the existence of such an orthodoxy was beneficial to the flourishing of the cultivation world. This was also the reason why he never extended his opinion of a certain monk or temple to the entire orthodoxy. However, the small Sumeru realm had nothing to ask of him, but there were places that needed his help. Otherwise, he might have stayed in the small Sumeru realm for a while. The Heavenly Eyes sent an order. Lu Xiaoyi wore a bamboo hat as a member of the Heavenly Eyes and entered the Yellow Springs Road to kill the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was one of the Hutu 8 cauldrons. The Hutu 8 cauldrons were a set of cauldron-shaped, innate spiritual treasures. Some of them had independent consciousness, while some had yet to awaken. Those with independent consciousness all had their own achievements, but those without independent consciousness could only be reduced to tools for humans. Of course, such a famous treasure was not in the hands of the cultivators of the current cultivation world. It had long been collected by people in the ancient times, and its whereabouts were unknown. This Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was collected by a cultivator. Later on, this cultivator became an immortal with it. He was immortal Wu Hua. His so-called Great Way of Leap Earth was actually taken from his cauldron. His so-called ancient method was actually the method of refining cauldrons. The so-called triple quenching of the furnace that was spread later was just an excuse to deceive others. It was no wonder that it could not be passed down and became unpopular. He couldn't pass it down because there was no second Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. Immortal Wu Hua became an immortal with the help of an innate spiritual treasure. It seemed a little unbelievable now, but in that era, there were all kinds of strange ways to become an immortal. There was no such thing as authentic or not. This was also the reason why the heavenly Tao was not perfect at that time. Exactly how immortal Wu Hua used the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was a cultivator's secret. It was not necessary to tell outsiders. However, it was also because he relied on external objects that when the great Tao began to collapse, immortal man immortals like him were the most dangerous group. This made Lu Xiaoyi understand a principle. In fact, the first immortals to fall might not be the worst in the immortal court, but their foundation in the Tao realm was definitely the worst. Once the great Tao of the golden immortals collapsed, it was time for those of them whose foundation was not solid and who did not purely rely on their own comprehension to ascend to the immortal court. More than 10 years ago, the scene of the Wu Hua celestial mountain in the interior realm meant that the old immortal had passed away. However, the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron that he borrowed from the ancient times did not follow him. Instead, it gave birth to its own spiritual consciousness when the old immortal had passed away. To the immortal elder, it was a disaster, but to Tian Ding, it was a rebirth. Death and life were the mysteries of cultivation. This was a general introduction to the Heaven's Eyes. It was something that had to be explained clearly in every mission. It would help the cultivators better judge the progress of the mission. But something must have gone wrong in the process. The Heaven's Eyes did not explain in detail, but Lu Xiaoyi's guess was that the birth of the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's spiritual consciousness was strange. Perhaps it was immortal Elder Wu Hua's escape plan, the complete transfer of his consciousness, or a partial concealment of his consciousness. To put it simply, the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's consciousness was not pure. It was contaminated and did not completely belong to him. In the foreseeable future, there was a high probability that the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron would be completely controlled by human consciousness again. How could a wild, independent consciousness fight against a scheming old soul that had lived for countless years? According to the rules of the Immortal Court, this kind of borrowing technique by immortals was intolerable. It would cause great harm to the order of immortal cultivation, block the path of the lower realm's advancement, and cause chaos to the immortal world. If everyone did this, wouldn't the Immortal Court be in chaos? As immortals, who didn't have a few tricks up their sleeves, such as substituting the plum for the peach tree, opening a hole would cause no end of trouble. Immortal Elder Wu Hua was knowingly breaking the law. He was greedy for luck. He placed his hopes on the ancient innate Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron, thinking that he could deceive the world and escape. Little did he know that although his lifespan was long, there were many existences in the Immortal Court that were older than him. No matter how cleverly he hid the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron and did not show it in front of people for millions of years, he still couldn't escape the attention of people. What's more, this was blasphemy to the numinous treasure race. The task given by the Immortal Court this time was chosen by the numinous treasure sovereign of the Heaven's Eyes. It chose two people, Bamboo Hat and Lu Xiaoyi. It didn't choose a Buddhist half-immortal because immortal Elder Wu Hua was the foundation of the Tao vein. In line with the principle of meat in the pot, dirty linen in the family, it could only be completed by a Taoist half-immortal. It chose Bamboo Hat because he had karma with immortal Elder Wu Hua. If you get benefits, you naturally have to contribute. Otherwise, you will take all the benefits and throw the mess to others. How could there be such a good thing in the world? It chose Lu Xiaoyi for unknown reasons. But then the Heaven's Eyes sent him a private message. The innate numinous treasure race will never allow the human consciousness to take over their nest. Identify the origin of the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's consciousness and expel it from the human consciousness. Even if the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron returns to the chaos, it will not hesitate. In extreme cases, it can even destroy the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron. This time, Bamboo Hat was the main target because he had karma. If he has any other thoughts, he will be killed. Below, there was a vague picture of a pagoda. Lu Xiaoyi curled his lips. Lord Linglong? Sovereign? You really think highly of me? The situation was already very clear. Lord Linglong found two people to carry out the task. One was the main target and was also a cover. The other was a supplement and was given the power to make arbitrary decisions. If necessary, he could even kill Lord Linglong. He was very frank and was very clear about his likes and dislikes. Lu Xiaoyi saw very clearly that Lord Linglong was very clear about the dispute between him and Bamboo Hat. This also indirectly showed that Bamboo Hat's targeting of Lu Xiaoyi was not completely out of personal motives, but also the intentions of other celestial lords. The two of them both wanted the 36 innate great Tao. This was a natural mutual incompatibility, and with the instigation of other celestial lords, he was very curious. As the four celestial lords of the Heaven's Eyes, was it really okay for two of them to target each other so openly? The Bamboo Hat man was very concerned about him, but he was just the opposite. He had never taken this proud son of heaven to heart, nor had he deliberately looked for trouble with him. Of course, he couldn't find him either, because this guy had always been avoiding him. Missions from the Heaven's Eyes could be rejected. Bamboo Hat did not reject this time, which meant that he had confidence in himself. The experience of the second severance, more than a dozen years ago, gave him enough confidence in his heart. Let's see what kind of quality he was. Lu Xiaoyi was still not too concerned. He was someone who knew his priorities and knew that the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was the most important target. Against an opponent like Bamboo had, he had long since lost that urge to kill him as soon as possible. That was because he understood more and more that in this cultivation world, there were many things that could not be solved by killing. He was enjoying this process. As for killing, it was only a convenient thing to do in the process of enjoyment and to adjust his cultivation. Chapter 1983. Where was the road to the underworld? Everyone had different opinions. Lu Xiaoyi's attitude was that he would know what he needed to know and what he shouldn't. Just like the odd righteous pure land. If he didn't go there, how would he know that every cultivator had their own odd righteous pure land? Just like now, when it was time for him to use it, he would know, but messed up his rhythm. He was supposed to go to the road of no return, the phoenix perch nest. He couldn't help it. A beam of light appeared in the void. It was the transmission channel of the heavenly eye, the power of an immortal. Clearly, the road to the underworld this time was a real path, not an illusion like the one in the odd righteous pure land. Lord Linglong was a little anxious. Since it involved an innate spiritual treasure, it probably wasn't an ordinary one either. Lu Xiaoyi was a little curious, but he knew that his curiosity was inappropriate. Flying into the light beam channel was like entering a strange space-time tunnel. He had a deep understanding of space-time, but he couldn't fully understand its mysteries. But from his point of view, he couldn't break open this space-time tunnel with his current ability. It wasn't only because of his lack of knowledge, but also because of his cultivation. He couldn't see any other cultivators around him. This was determined by the nature of the space-time tunnel. Even if two people entered at the same time and from the same position, they wouldn't see each other. Of course, he had no companions this time. When Lu Xiaoyi appeared on the other side of the light beam channel, he found that he was not alone. There were a few half-immortal cultivators scattered in the distance. Looking further, there were many more. There were dozens of cultivators within the range of his perception sense, and hundreds of cultivators within the range of his divine sense. There should be some outside the range of his perception sense. He was familiar with these people. Some of them were in the interior realm, and some were in the exterior realm. He quickly realized the strangeness of this mission. It didn't seem like it was just him and the bamboo hat. It was more like a big battlefield. Lu Xiaoyi's reaction was very fast. Was there any place in the universe that required the inner and outer scenic skies to work together? There was only one, the wall of reflection. The road to the underworld was the wall of reflection, and the wall of reflection was the road to the underworld. It was the same thing, just different names. It was all because of those people who liked to play with the names to make up the numbers. Beside these Blight Realm cultivators, there were many shadows. In the deep space, there was no place for shadows to withstand, so these shadows were actually mirror images of the Blight Realm cultivators. One person and one shadow looked like they were dancing, but they were actually fighting for their lives and were abnormally fierce. The mirror images outside were just the other selves of those cultivators who had died in the deteriorating state. They were a kind of obsession, and their strength would never surpass the original. Therefore, most of the cultivators of the exterior realm, except for those who were really not good at fighting, could still be killed. However, the energy bodies of resentment inside were different. They were not the mirror images of ancient cultivators, but monsters formed by the resentment of countless cultivators. They might be able to cast spells or recite Buddhist scriptures. They might even be able to form a flying sword. Their unpredictability was their greatest characteristic. The wall of mirrors wasn't a physical barrier. Instead, it was a mental barrier that was supported by countless thoughts. After millions of years, cultivators of the Blight Realm had appeared. Until now, how many cultivators of the Blight Realm had thrown their thoughts here? Judging from the tens of thousands of Blight Realm cultivators of the exterior realm, there were at least millions of them. It was very likely that there were millions of them. With so many cultivators' thoughts mixed together, entangling with each other, and fermenting, What kind of spiritual barrier would be formed? Just thinking about it was terrifying. It was no wonder that even immortals would turn pale at the mention of it. This was the graveyard of the Blight Realm cultivators after their deaths. It wasn't their bodies that were buried, but all kinds of thoughts, resentment, and obsessions. They lingered here for a long time, so it didn't seem wrong to call it the road to the underworld. The mission of the half-immortals of the interior and exterior realm for tens of thousands of years was to eliminate, or rather, suppress the madness of these spiritual bodies. As the signs of the universe's changes became more and more obvious, the spiritual bodies of resentment here became more and more restless. They were a source of disaster that could explode at any time. If these resentment escaped to the universe and took over, it would bring about disastrous consequences to the universe's cultivation world. The half-immortals of the interior realm had to come here to carry out their mission once every few hundred years. Lu Xiaoyi hadn't had his turn yet, but it was probably a matter of time. Now, he could only treat it as coming here to familiarize himself with the environment. The Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron came to this kind of place. It thought that this place could hide its unique thoughts and spirits, but under the attention of the immortal court, deity Wu Hua's methods were still not clever enough. The bamboo hat and Lu Xiaoyi's mission was to enter the wall of mirrors and find the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron. Then, according to the specific situation, they would make a judgment whether to wipe out the spiritual consciousness or directly destroy the cauldron body. They weren't in a hurry to go in, but they observed from the outside, but it was difficult to find familiar faces. These cultivators had persevered here for hundreds of years, even before he was qualified to enter the interior realm. It could be said that they didn't know him at all. He didn't need to be too cautious. As a half-immortal, some things could be understood at a glance. Moreover, he wasn't completely ignorant about the wall of mirrors. After entering the interior realm, he still had some understanding of the two most crucial methods of activity. He didn't need to wait for the bamboo hat, just like how the bamboo hat wouldn't wait for him if he came. Whoever found it would be the one to take it. One person could act more freely, but when two people really met, he was afraid that they would guard against each other more than against the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron. Outside the wall of mirrors, there were a few big stars, but they were bare and had nothing. Thus, he didn't have any thoughts and directly cast his gaze toward the wall of mirrors. When Lu Xiaoyi passed through this thin layer of spiritual barrier, even with his firm sword heart, he couldn't help but feel a trace of wavering in his heart. However, a spirit with a carrier and an illusory spirit body couldn't be compared at all, so he passed through. When he entered the other side of the wall of mirrors, the pressure on his spirit disappeared. What followed was the leakage of energy from his body that was everywhere. It was as if there was a huge vacuum pump in the unseen world, sucking in anything with energy from his body. Mana, spirit, chi essence, even willpower and Tao heart. It was as if all the pores on his body had automatically opened up. He tried all the self-sealing essence gates, dharma walls, and divine orifices that he had learned before, but he still couldn't stop this kind of leakage. This was a normal phenomenon. Even a man immortal couldn't resist the leakage, so it was normal that he couldn't do it. Some items, such as the great medicine and tonic pills, couldn't be taken out of the storage ring. Once they were seen in this universe space, they would immediately lose their medicinal efficacy. Some Taoist and celestial items couldn't stay here for long, and their spirituality would be greatly damaged. This kind of situation was very troublesome for those cultivators who relied on great medicine and items to fight. Fortunately, the speed at which a cultivator's body leaked out was acceptable. According to his estimation, if he sat here without moving and didn't consider the consumption of his energy in battle, his vast and pure reserves of essence, energy, and soul could last for at least 10 years before reaching the dangerous red line below 50%. Chapter 1984. Lu Xiaoyi began to adapt to the environment here. He soon discovered that the interior heaven half-immortals entered the space behind the mirror to search for resentful spirits and destroy them. They retreated when they could not hold on any longer and rested outside the wall of the mirror to replenish their essence, chi, and spirit before entering again. They would wait until the 360-year period was up before changing to the next batch. Lu Xiaoyi looked back first. No matter where he went, his timid first reaction would be to figure out the way back instead of blindly rushing forward. What made him feel relieved was that the wall of the mirror was just one of the many celestial phenomena in the universe. It was inconspicuous and difficult to distinguish. However, once he entered the wall of the mirror and looked around with his divine sense, everything would be illusory. He would not even be able to find a fist-sized meteorite, let alone other celestial phenomena. Everything would be inexplicably devoured by this space. Here, he could only see one celestial phenomenon, an abnormal fluctuation, and a bright color. That was the wall of the mirror. Therefore, it seemed that he did not have to worry about not being able to find the way back. This was just entering the wall of the mirror. What if he went deeper? Would it be so easy? According to Lu Xiaoyi's habit of being cautious, the more obvious the path was, the more dangerous it was. If someone could create a lighthouse-like thing in this space, it would put the cultivator in an unknown danger. If this lighthouse-like thing was placed in a dead end and the cultivator ran in the wrong direction, more than half of his energy would be extracted after 10 years. What would that mean? This was a typical late-stage conspiracy theory, but this was the basic quality of a cultivator. You had to think of the worst-case scenario. After tens of thousands of years, it wasn't as if there hadn't been cultivators in the inner and western scenic skies who couldn't find their way back because they went too deep. Of course, there were also man-made disasters, but that was another matter. Inside the wall of the mirror, there were relatively fewer resentful spirits at the space barrier. This was the result of long-term persistence over tens of thousands of years. Only by going deeper could one encounter these spirits. The deeper one went, the more they would encounter them. In such a vast and infinite space, the mere 50 interior cultivators and hundreds of exterior cultivators were like streams flowing into the sea. They could not even cause a ripple. Relatively speaking, the ancient and weak cultivators were not very attractive. Or rather, they were not attractive at all. Which of the existences who left their immortal thoughts here did not have the body of a half-immortal? Only the immortals, when they came to this space, were like bright lights in the wilderness that attracted countless insects and moths. They were also like rotten meat that attracted taut-eyed beasts. This was because these resentful spirits were reluctant and persistent in becoming immortals. This was the reason why the immortals were not willing to come down to solve this problem. Of course, it was also because they wanted to find something for these idle half-immortals to do. Those who were tasked here were all half-immortals who had taken the first or second step. They knew how to balance their actions. They would not be impulsive and disregard themselves for the happiness of all humans. They would not be sneaky and not put in effort. The principle was to do their best within the scope of their abilities. This was the basic understanding and attitude of every cultivator who came here. Lu Xiaoyi's goal was not to destroy the resentful spirits. He was here to find the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, so he did not need to consider how to destroy them. But where was the Heaven Cauldron? If it was hidden very deep, it meant that he would be taking a higher risk than ordinary people. There were so many interior and exterior half-immortals here. He did not believe that there were no Heaven-Eye cultivators among them. Wouldn't it be better to find a group nearby to do it? Why'd he have to take off his pants and fart? He had to find 2 enemies. This was the rule of immortals. They were more inclined to deal with the messy and so-called far-reaching matters behind the matter rather than the matter as it was. The first thing he had to do was to determine his position. But his current position was much easier than those seniors of his. Tens of thousands of years ago, among the first batch of interior and exterior half-immortals who entered here, there was the Crow ancestor. At that time, they could be said to be surrounded by danger and had nothing to rely on. But after tens of thousands of years, generations of cultivators set up countless beacon towers in the wall of mirrors for their own safety. Slowly, a system was formed, and it was quite large. As long as you didn't go too far, you didn't have to worry about not being able to find your way back. After understanding this, he began to prepare to come into contact with those resentful spirits. Although there were countless seniors who had left behind countless experiences to fight with them over the past tens of thousands of years, it was still shallow to read on paper. He had to put it into practice. In principle, even the weakest half-immortals could deal with a few of them at the same time, as long as you did not pull too many of them and seek death. Under the guidance of this thought, Lu Xiaoyi began to fly inside and took the initiative to provoke these hateful and pitiful spirits. Actually, they were all pitiful people. Since there had been cultivation in the universe, too many cultivators had fallen at the last step of becoming a celestial. Their most common characteristic was that they would never give up on becoming a celestial. Whether it was those who were only a step away from the second severance, or those who were still a step away from the first severance, their feelings were all the same. Becoming a celestial was to sever one's obsession. If one could not sever it, this kind of obsession would not disappear even after death. With no place to put it, it was captured and brought to the reflecting mirror wall, causing them to only become a kind of resentful spirit after losing their self-awareness. They retained all their obsession and part of their abilities, but completely forgot that they had once been human. They were a kind of pure spirit energy body with the goal of becoming a celestial. This kind of spirit energy body began to change in a dangerous direction after accumulating for several million years. This was also an inevitable law of nature, just like how methane would be produced after being piled up in a cesspool for a long time. And now, it had caught up with the changes of heaven and earth. These spirit energy bodies all had different personalities. There were cowardly ones, and there were also brave ones. Of course, there were also those that were cunning. Destroying them was not a problem, but the problem was how to do it in the most time, effort, and origin energy. He had to think of a more difficult problem. If he wanted to complete his mission under the siege of countless resentful spirit energy bodies, he would need to have a deep tactical understanding of these things. With a flash, flying swords filled the sky, surrounding the resentful spirit energy body in the middle, forming a tornado of flying swords. Through continuously changing Tao realms, he was testing what this thing was most wary of. Absolute void was useless, the 5 elements were useless, and yin and yang were useless. Slaughter, destruction, lightning, 5 ties, impermanence, space, and so on, the Tao realms that Lu Xiaoyi was proficient in were completely useless against this thing. Thus, he tried various sword techniques. Controlling the sword was definitely meaningless against the spirit body, and it was the same for killing swords. He focused on the Tao sword system that the Crow ancestor had created, which was the more obscure and strange sword techniques that originated from the Western Zhao sword technique system. Chapter 1985. The main target of Lu Xiaoyi's swordsmanship system was human beings, demonic beasts, and all living things with physical bodies. It was not just a bunch of random thoughts. In fact, for something like this, if he used the celestial swordsmanship created by the Crow ancestor to deal with it, the large-scale destructive energy impact should be effective. However, doing so would consume too much mana. Moreover, he had not learned the celestial swordsmanship yet. After he took the first step, he had his own understanding of swordsmanship. He did not have to follow the Crow ancestor's old path. The Crow ancestor created the astronomical swordsmanship because his understanding of the Tao was limited. His specialty was that he had mastered all 36 Taos. Of course, different specialties would lead to different directions of swordsmanship. The vengeful spirit's counterattack was just as ferocious. In a short period of time, the vengeful spirit had used several different methods of attack. There were the Dharma images of body cultivators, the spiritual attacks of soul cultivators, and the forbidden arts of Taoism. These attacks were unleashed by the spirit body without the slightest hesitation. However, the problem was that it was not a spirit body with a complete soul. It had no plans or traps. In short, its attacks did not have a soul. In a battle like Lu Xiaoyi's, the effect it could achieve was very limited. The method was quickly found. The sword of light, the burning of ashes, the reversion of fate, the conversion of merit, and so on. With a start, the next step was a matter of course. This was how swordsmanship worked. Once you understood how to destroy the essence of these things, you would be able to find many ways to deal with them. This was especially true for swordsmen like Lu Xiaoyi, who had a wide range of swordsmanship and was an expert in swordsmanship. After he found the method, he began to test the rate of depletion of his elemental energy. For example, the rate of depletion of his elemental energy, the rate of depletion of his elemental energy in battle, the rate of depletion of his elemental energy when he remained still, and so on. Finally, he gathered a group of more than 10 vengeful spirits and killed them together. After observing the rate of depletion of his elemental energy, he was finally able to estimate how long he could stay here. Not bad. He estimated that he could stay here for 7 to 8 years. After that, he would have to return to prevent his elemental energy from being depleted. He also had to take into account the possibility of encountering human cultivators with ill intentions. After he was ready, Lu Xiaoyi floated in the void and formed a breath. This breath was given to him by the Heavenly Eyes Lord when he was sent here. It could be used to find innate spiritual treasures and identify their traces. The aura floated up like a white rainbow. It shot straight up, then split into 3 branches and floated in 3 different directions. Upon seeing this, Lu Xiaoyi could not help but want to complain. 3 branches, how was he supposed to find them? The numinous treasure lord had the responsibility to control the innate and acquired numinous treasures of the primary world, but there was a difference. The numinous treasures of the Heavenly Eye system had their every move under the Lord's watch. This was even more perverse than the human immortal monarch's control over their subordinates. It wasn't that the numinous treasure lord was stronger, but that there were simply too many human cultivators and too few numinous treasures. But for the Heavenly Eyes system of Heavenly Lord's control was limited. He could not know all of them like the back of his hand, especially those that had just gained sentience. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was within this range. Therefore, the Heavenly Lord's guidance could only provide the direction of 3 innate spiritual treasures. There were 3 innate spiritual treasures in the mirror image wall. As for which one was which, he had to find it himself. Very unreliable. If the bamboo hat was here, he should have sensed it first, because he had a mysterious connection with immortal Wu Hua when he was in the interior realm. How should he choose? Lu Xiaoyi stared at the 3 forks of white smoke for a long time, but it was all in vain. He couldn't see anything. He did not know much about innate spiritual treasures. He had never owned such a big thing. He could only make a judgment based on the direction. He put the direction that led directly to the depths of the mirror last, and chose the direction towards the edge. This was a consideration of his mentality. Of the 3 directions, 2 were easy and 1 was deep. The deepest was most likely to be the location of the innate spiritual treasures. So what would you choose? Many people would choose to go deeper into the forest because it was common knowledge that those who were fleeing would definitely go deeper into the forest. But the problem was that when you went deeper and deeper in this direction, but still could not find the target, you would inevitably doubt yourself. Is it in this direction? Will the other party do the opposite? And so on. You would question your own thoughts. In the end, you would become less confident and hesitant when going deeper. The correct way was to first settle the 2 easy directions. After confirming that it was not the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, he would focus on the 3rd direction. It might take more time, but the goal was clear and the direction was firm. He did not care too much about who completed this task. If he could complete it without exerting himself, why not? With this train of thought, his mentality was very relaxed. He only went along the edge and increased his speed to the maximum. He was like a stream of light all the way. He had been searching for him for an entire year. Ding Shan had been loitering in the vicinity for a very long time. As an exterior half-immortal, it could be said that he was not working hard in the wall of mirrors. 100 years had passed, and the deadline to return was approaching. He was ready to start the plan that he had been preparing for 100 years. He was a 3rd decay half-immortal. In the exterior realm, his ability could be considered outstanding. His orthodoxy was also a branch of Taoism. He could be considered a half-immortal with a relatively bright future. The cultivators of the main world always felt that these half-immortals were superior and looked down on all living things. They did not know that in the exterior realm, the suffering of half-immortals was also incomprehensible. Becoming an immortal was a wish, but the cruel reality was there were 10,000 half-immortals in the exterior realm. They only had a chance to become an immortal once in tens of thousands of years. There were many fourth decay and fifth decay half-immortals waiting anxiously. There were many demons below. The cultivators of the lower world could not understand their anxiety. If he did not take the risk, he would forever become a spectator. The change of the era would have nothing to do with him. Here, in the wall of mirrors, these pitiful and hateful, resentful spirits were his final destination. No one was willing to be like this. In the past 1,000 years, the number of exterior half-immortals dying was much higher than in history. Moreover, this trend was still worsening. It was not because of the abnormal environment, but because more and more half-immortals were adopting more radical methods in the process of cultivation. There were those who complied with the law, those who were not, those who were struggling on their deathbed, and those who were staking everything on one throw. Everyone was frantically testing the waters at the edge of success and failure, just for this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity like the change of the era. Why must the opportunity belong to the fourth decay and fifth decay? On what basis should those so-called up-and-coming talents occupy the leading position? Just because they were reincarnated at the right time? In fact, the overflowing of the heart plate was a reflection of this mentality. It could not be controlled. The great change was coming. Everyone had a chance to fight the waves. If they did not fight now, when would they? Chapter 1986. Ding Shan was also gambling, but everyone's gambling method was different. He was from the equipment refining sect, which was also an orthodox Taoist inheritance, just like the Tao of pills and talismans. To the swordsman's orthodoxy, they were the kind of impure cultivators who relied too much on external objects. However, in their ideology, what was the difference between the equipment refining sect relying on external objects and the swordsman relying on swords? Since he was from the equipment refining sect, it was a test of each cultivator's background. Unfortunately, his orthodoxy was very strong, but his power was far from the resources of the real big powers in the universe. In the eyes of others, he was very rich, but only he knew that his little bit of wealth was not enough in front of the real big powers half-immortals. And the equipment refining sect's reliance on external objects was very important. For example, if he wanted to quickly pass through the third decay, he needed a divine object to help him speed up the process of his primordial spirit's decay. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would not be able to catch up with the change of era before the fifth decay, and would lose this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Divine objects were hard to find in the world. To bear the primordial spirit of a third decay, half-immortal, it was not something that ordinary objects could bear. Ding Shan had searched the universe for thousands of years, but he could not find it. This was also fate. He had to admit that compared to the ancient times, it was very difficult to find scraps in the current cultivation world. Everyone had been searching for scraps for millions of years, so how could it be his turn? He could wear out iron shoes to look for something in vain, only to find it by chance. After searching for thousands of years, he could not find a suitable divine object. This time, he had no choice but to participate in the mirror observation mission, and he actually found one, and it was an ownerless object. The empty divine magic conch, an ownerless and innate spiritual treasure. It was just placed in the mirror observation wall, and no one picked it up, and it had been floating there for thousands of years. It was not that no one really wanted it, but it was because it had a special function. The mirror observation wall had a leak, and the inner and outer scenic sky cultivators started to enter and sweep, so the positioning of the mirror observation wall became a big problem. However, in the world of cultivation, there was never a lack of people who were broad-minded and had good karma. Therefore, there were always half-immortals who set up their own beacon towers in unfamiliar airspace to point out the direction for later generations. Even though there were only a handful of such people, the wall of mirrors had formed a perfect system of guidance over the past tens of thousands of years. At the very least, this system was still very complete within a certain distance of the stronghold. But it was a different story if one ventured any deeper. Given enough time, the entire wall of mirrors would be covered by this system one day. Most of the Waymark artifacts left behind were ordinary artifacts that would lose their effectiveness over time. Then, someone would replace them with new artifacts. However, there were also some system fulcrum artifacts that were extremely precious. For example, the empty divine magic conch. It was unknown which selfless person had placed it here, but it was used as a supporting Waymark node in this large airspace. After tens of thousands of years, it had not moved at all. It was not that no one had ever thought about this innate spiritual treasure, but since it was in the entire Waymark system, its existence naturally affected all the half-immortals who came in. Once someone made a move, everyone would know. Under such circumstances, who would end up in a situation where everyone wanted to beat them up. It was precisely because of this that this innate spiritual treasure that did not have any innate spiritual intelligence had been floating here for tens of thousands of years. It was completely embedded in the Waymark system. As time passed, it became a big attraction of the mirror observation wall. Many half-immortals would come a look at it after entering and sighing with regret before leaving. Thus, it became a symbol, a lucky spiritual treasure, and received everyone's respect. In this wave of half-immortals, whether it was the interior or exterior immortals, it was almost time for them to return. Therefore, they had already seen what they wanted to see. Up until now, other than Ding Shan, who was still wandering around not far away, there were no other cultivators. Ever since he saw this treasure, he wanted to take it for himself. He had no choice. A man's ambition was short when he was poor, and a horse's hair was long when it was thin. He knew that this was wrong, but in order to save himself, he could not care so much. After 100 years of planning and meticulous preparation, the drama of swapping a leopard cat for the crown prince was about to be completed. The plan was very complicated, but also very simple. It was to create an artifact that could temporarily replace the empty divine magic conch. For a refiner like him, it was not easy to achieve this. However, after 100 years of observation, where there was a will, there was a way. He really made such a thing. Whether it was the guidance of the Waymark, the fluctuation of the aura, the attribute of the spiritual treasure, or even the appearance, it was enough to pass off as the real thing. But the problem was, of course, it was impossible for him to really create a treasure that was the same as an innate spiritual treasure. He could do this because the empty divine magic conch only used a small part of its abilities in the Waymark system. He only needed to simulate this part. His imitation could not withstand close observation, and the time it could use the Waymark system was also very limited. Therefore, when to replace, it was a very important problem. He set the time to when his mission period was up. At that time, hundreds of people would leave, and no one would suspect the small changes in the Waymark system. When the next batch of inner and outer scenic sky cultivators came in, he would have already returned to the exterior scenic sky. When someone found out, the two batches of half-immortals added up to more than 1,000 people, who would interrogate them one by one. It was a flawless plan. Before that, he would secretly replace the fake with the real one. At the same time, he would secretly observe everyone's reaction. If someone came to check, he would replace it with the real one. If no one noticed, then he would continue. There were still a few years left. He was amazed at himself for having such a perfect plan. Just like the situation now, there were two identical empty divine magic conches floating in the void, faithfully carrying out their duties. If it was not intentional, it would be very difficult for anyone to notice that he had really put in all his effort in this imitation. This was also a kind of psychological compensation. After all, he had taken away something that was public, which was very immoral. Ding Shan paced back and forth at the maximum controllable distance from his imitation. He destroyed a few spiritual bodies here and there. This kind of life would still take a few years. It was very boring and dry. He was worried and afraid that some blind and nosy person would come and ruin his good deed. This kind of life was very torturous. But if a person had the motivation to become an immortal and had the experience of thousands of years of painstakingly searching for treasures, then all of this was not so unbearable. Cultivation was very difficult. What was difficult was not only the body, but more importantly, the soul. The despair in the struggle, the unwillingness in the despair, the madness in the unwillingness. When all of these were mixed together, there was nothing that they did not dare to do. Chapter 1987. The Law of Cultivation. When you are afraid of something, it will definitely come. The two Chis approached quickly. Ding Shan sighed in his heart and quickly put away the fake magic conch. Then he pulled a resentful spiritual body and pretended to be there. Not everyone was interested in the empty divine magic conch. Some were just passing by, and some came to see the innate spiritual treasure. To him, these two cultivators were strangers. It was normal that they didn't know each other in the exterior community. The two came together and didn't pay attention to Ding Shan, who was far away. They just walked around the innate spiritual treasure as if it was their first time seeing it. After observing for a long time, two cultivators flew towards Ding Shan. This made him have a bad premonition in his heart. His method was very clever, but there were many people in the half-immortal community who were more clever than him. He was betting that no one would have any improper thoughts about the empty god magic conch in the next 10,000 years. He didn't think that his method could really deceive everyone here. As expected, one of the unfamiliar half-immortals said, "How should I address you? It is fate that we meet. We are new here, and there are some things that we don't understand. Please help us." Ding Shan said politely, "It's okay. We are all exterior masters and should help each other. I am Ding Shan, and I will tell you everything I know." One of the half-immortals said with a smile, "Then can you tell me why the empty divine magic conchs are sometimes strong and sometimes weak? Is it real and sometimes illusory? It was the same before we came, but why is it the same when we get closer?" Ding Shan's heart tightened. The biggest obstacle to his plan was here. If he couldn't get through this obstacle, his hundreds of years of preparation would be in vain. "I don't understand what you are talking about. What do you mean?" The two unfamiliar half-immortals looked at each other and smiled. One of them pointed out the purpose of their visit. "Let's put it this way. Are you really here to kill the spiritual evil, or do you have other purposes?" Seeing Ding Shan's vigilant face, the two laughed. "Let's not beat around the bush. You can't hide the fact that you want the empty divine magic conch. We are not here to stop people from cultivating. We just want to get a piece of the pie. I wonder if fellow Taoist Ding can fulfill our wish?" Ding Shan's eyes narrowed. "The two of you aren't even willing to tell me your names, yet you want to threaten me?" A half-immortal's voice gradually turned cold. "If we have an agreement, then we will naturally tell you our identities. However, if fellow Taoist Ding doesn't want to cooperate, then I'm afraid it won't be good for you to know our names." Ding Shan knew that it was impossible for this matter to be settled peacefully. Since the other party dared to ask so bluntly, of course, he didn't have any good intentions. There was also nothing to hide. Acting dumb in front of a half-immortal was completely meaningless. Once the cultivation of the vital spirit takes a step forward, it will be no more than a half-immortal of the exterior realm. At this moment, he came to the wall of mirrors. If he was not forced by an exterior task, then it could only be that he wanted to avoid trouble. I heard that an exterior expert was punished by an interior expert a few days ago. Don't tell me you're one of the hundreds of exterior evildoers who are wanted. The younger generation will surpass us in time. You can't even take care of yourself, yet you dare to come to the wall of mirrors to threaten your seniors? Both of them were quick-witted people. No one could hide from the other. Ding Shan's intentions were seen through at a glance. But the identities of the two evildoers of the exterior realm were also exposed by him. The two evildoers looked at each other, their hearts surging with murderous intent. They were indeed two of the evildoers of the exterior realm who were involved with the Heartplate. After being announced as the targets of the assassination by Lu Tian, they had been somewhat anxious in the main world all day long. This was because they didn't know whether this kind of arrest was limited to the evildoers of the interior realm, or was it related to the entire interior and exterior realm. If it was the latter, then it would really bring them endless trouble. Another point was, how did the new exterior immortal monarch resolve this matter? These two evildoers were the most agile among this group of people. Through some channels, they got in touch with the grand cultivators of the exterior realm. With the tacit consent of the Jade Booklet, they agreed to use a certain disguised method to obtain the forgiveness of the exterior realm. This method was to go to the Wall of Mirrors to work to offset their past sins. There was no contract. It was a kind of tacit understanding. That was why they came here. However, for people like them, it was impossible for their ideas and actions to be restrained just because of the punishment of the interior realm. The change of the era was imminent. Everyone was working hard to move forward. They were used to using the method they thought was right. They wouldn't change because of anyone. For the time being, they couldn't touch the Heartplate, but there were other methods, such as the famous empty divine magic conch of the Wall of Mirrors. Under the circumstances, everyone had their own ambitions. This couldn't be considered wrong. You, Lu Tian, had your own path. Should others just sit around and wait for death? Since they had the empty divine magic conch, they immediately found something fishy after careful observation. This was a helpless coincidence. Ding Shan's various methods were to deceive the half-immortals who had stayed in the Mirror of Mirrors for a long time. He had indeed done it perfectly. However, he didn't expect that the heavens wouldn't listen to his wishes. Out of nowhere, two greenhorns appeared. These two people didn't have the so-called experience. As a result, the experienced veterans were all kept in the dark. Only these two inexperienced people discovered that something was wrong with the treasure at the first moment. When they arrived at the scene and saw Ding Shan, they immediately understood that they had met their peers. Peers always had a tacit understanding of each other. One of the evildoers was very direct. I'm Thimble Needle. This is Leaf Fan. Since everyone has said it out loud, we won't beat around the bush. Before we came, we vaguely felt that the aura of the magic conch was uncertain. It was as if there were two magic conches alternating their effects. I think the real thing is here. The other one is fellow Taoist Ding's item, right? The empty divine magic conch shouldn't be taken by force. Otherwise, if it was discovered, no one would be able to escape. However, everyone who saw it has a share. How can we take it for ourselves? Fellow Taoist has indeed exerted his strength. However, the two of us have strong methods. Who should take it and who should give it up? Why don't we establish a Tao contract? The treasure is shared by the three of us. We could take turns using it. Fellow Taoist Ding, do you think it's fair? Ding Shan's heart was tormented. With his thousands of years of experience, he knew that he couldn't agree to this. It sounded nice that the treasure was shared by the three of them. If you really agreed to it, there would be endless follow-up methods that would make you unable to stop. After all, he was the one who replaced it. The so-called contract was to tie him up with a shackle. The more it was tied up, the tighter it would get. Moreover, it was almost impossible to reach an understanding regarding the time of use, because he was going to use this treasure to help him pass through the decline of his primordial spirit. This time could easily be over 1,000 years. How could they coordinate? Moreover, there was still, I'm not stealing it. I'm just borrowing it. After I'm done using it, I'll return it. This is my bottom line. As for you guys, I promise not to tell anyone about your whereabouts and purpose. I also won't affect you guys from collecting the treasure. This is my bottom line. Chapter 1988. Both sides parted on bad terms and were destined to have irreconcilable differences. The two evildoers separated. Needless to say, the outcome would be decided by their hands. 4 half-immortals, Their words and actions were carefully considered and would not change easily. This was the so-called persistence of the Tao heart. Moreover, they also had their own methods to take away the empty, divine magic conch. Although it might not be as strict as Ding Shan's, it was still worth a try. After all, they were not on the mission list and could escape after the mission. The prerequisite was that they had to kill this guy who did not know how to appreciate favors. He had asked for their names for no reason, but in the end, he still rejected their request for cooperation. Ding Shan sighed in his heart, knowing that a battle to the death was unavoidable. He did not choose to escape. As a half-immortal of tools, there was a certain gap between him and those half-immortals who were good at fighting. But he had his own methods. With a move of his consciousness, he connected with an indigo bead lying in ambush in the distance. That indigo bead immediately exploded, but the power was controlled to a very small degree. It was only an indescribable spiritual wave attack. Following the explosion of this indigo bead, more indigo beads lying in ambush in all directions exploded one by one. Almost at the same time, with a flip of his hand, more than 10 half-immortal weapons were thrown into the air. Each of them displayed their power and formed a battlefield space that covered the two half-immortal evildoers. Strike first to gain the upper hand. Even if he was not a battle type, he understood the true meaning of battle. If you are at a disadvantage, you have to go all out. This was also the mainstream battle mode of the cultivation world in the recent 10,000 years. Don't hold back at the beginning and use your momentum first. Thimbleleaf Fan smiled and used his own methods to fight back. In the exterior realm, the traditional cultivators of the Blight State did not have the advantage in strength against these evildoers. This was also the characteristic of the Blight State. The body of the first Blight State was not good. The magical power of the second Blight State was the shortcoming, and the third Blight Primordial Spirit had loopholes. These were all very obvious flaws that could be easily targeted. Only when the cultivators of the Blight State reached the fourth Blight and fifth Blight could they fully display their strength. But Ding Shan was only at the third Blight. The loopholes in his primordial spirit were very obvious. They were confident that they could end this battle in a short time. Those quasi-immortal artifacts looked intimidating, but they were just some half-spiritual objects. Although they weren't completely dead, it was a fact that they lacked spiritual intelligence. When one reached the quasi-immortal realm, one wouldn't care too much about such magical objects. They might be very powerful, but they were too rigid. The battle prowess of the equipment refining sex half-immortals largely depended on whether or not they had a truly top-notch item, such as a natural spiritual treasure. Li Fan used a large area of effect Tao realm to sweep out, instantly attracting the attack power of those quasi-immortal artifacts. On this side, the thimble had already forcibly broken through. For people who played with weapons, what they were most afraid of was the opponent breaking through and entering a short distance. Once the opponent got close, their refining skills would not be able to serve a living person. One pull and one dash, it was extremely ingenious. At the very least, Ding Shan didn't have any means to deal with it. But he still knew his principles, and that was not to run. As long as he ran, with his mediocre escape technique, he would fall into an irreversible situation. Thimble's breakthrough went smoothly, but she immediately felt that something was wrong. This was because around Ding Shan's body, a large number of resentment spirits were coming one after another. What was even more troublesome was that there were even more spirit bodies constantly surging over. Ding Shan hadn't completely placed his hopes on the carelessness of others in the 100 years he had been here. He had also prepared a battle method for himself, not with his quasi-immortal artifacts, but with the resentment spirits that were everywhere in the wall of the reflecting mirror. For 100 years, he had constantly placed indigo pearls in order to lure these things over at critical moments. Spirit bodies couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. They attacked indiscriminately. But Ding Shan could rely on more artifacts to deal with this kind of challenge. After 100 years in the wall of the reflecting realm, he was very experienced in dealing with these resentment spirits. But it was different for these two monsters. To Ding Shan, This kind of arrangement was originally just a way to escape. After all, according to his judgment, the people who came were very likely to have rich experience in dealing with spirit bodies like him. But now, since it was two brats who thought they were monsters, he didn't mind ruthlessly eliminating them. A large number, hundreds of resentment spirits rushed over and instantly surrounded the three of them. They didn't have any obvious preference, and their instinctive obsession was stimulated by the indigo pearls. At this time, any human cultivator was their target, and there was no distinction between them. This kind of sudden situation completely disrupted Thimble and Li Fan's rhythm. They also didn't know where so many resentment spirits came from. They only knew that rays of indigo light rapidly shot over, followed by large groups of spirit bodies. Dingshan immediately started his own defense. He didn't want to kill them, but his goal was to not anger these spirit bodies. Then, he would make a decision after seeing the reactions of these two brats. Thimble and Li Fan's reactions were the opposite. After all, there was a difference of several thousand years between them, so their actions were more proactive and more aggressive. Otherwise, why would they be called monsters? The resentment spirits' attacks towards the three of them were indiscriminate. Based on this principle, charging towards Dingshan was the most proactive way to kill. They didn't want to choose to defend separately. Who knew how many resentment spirits this old half-immortal could attract? If the three of them were busy dealing with the spirit bodies, Dingshan would have countless opportunities to escape. As long as the news of the two of them spread, it was hard to say whether or not the exterior cultivators would come to trouble them. But don't forget, there were still 50 interior half-immortals here who were also doing the killing mission. For the two of them, such a choice was undoubtedly the right choice. The only thing they didn't consider too clearly was the estimation of the number of spirit bodies rushing over. Just as they broke into Dingshan's close-range defense circle, the number of resentment spirits had already reached a terrifying number of thousands, and it was still increasing endlessly. Thimble and Li Fan found themselves in a quagmire. With such a dense degree, as long as they attacked Dingshan, they would inevitably attract the crazy revenge of the spirit bodies. They would think that this was an attack on them. So now, Dingshan obediently attacked and didn't fight back. He defended in a well-behaved manner. At least by doing so, the surrounding spirit bodies wouldn't fall into a state of madness. But he also had a problem. It was precisely because of his overly weak performance that the two brats of the exterior broke into the inner circle and stuck close to him. Thus, he lost the opportunity to leave alone. Both sides had achieved their goals, but they also didn't achieve it. The battle between the two sides turned into a three-sided melee, and the one who gained the advantage in the battle was actually the third party. In the mirror, situations like this where one accidentally got surrounded by spirit bodies were everywhere. In theory, as long as one had enough elemental energy reserves, they would have the ability to escape. But they couldn't escape not because of the huge number of spirit bodies, but because of each other's human opponents. Chapter 1989. Both sides were persevering, waiting for the other to make a mistake, waiting for an opportunity to change. Don't worry, his elemental energy reserves are not as good as ours. We'll wait until he can't hold on and is ready to escape, then we'll attack. Thimble said coldly. It was quite vexing for a battle that was bound to be won to end up like this. However, even though she was vexed, she couldn't lose her judgment. Inside the reflecting mirror wall, spirit was extracted in proportion. Therefore, even if the other's cultivation was slightly deeper than theirs, under the proportion, they would definitely collapse before them. They had rushed straight for the spirit treasure after entering, so their reserves were much stronger than Dingshan, who had been guarding this place the entire time. Li Fan laughed sinisterly. Don't attack him, just keep him occupied. I want him to die under the resentment of the spiritual bodies. Dingshan had achieved his goal, but the problem was that he didn't expect two opponents to come at once, so he couldn't use the means he had prepared. He was very clear that as long as he used his trump card, it was hard to say whether he could get rid of one of the two, but he would definitely be torn to pieces by the other and countless spiritual bodies. He had prepared a meal for one person, but two guests had come. He sighed deeply in his heart. A half-immortal like him, who wasn't very good at fighting, was actually very depressed and full of powerlessness when he was in a real dangerous situation. He had pulled the two evildoers into the sea of spiritual bodies, but he had also pulled himself into a dilemma. But he didn't regret it. At least, he still had one last move. He would continue to waste time. Even if his ability withered, how strong could the opponent be? 1 for 2, it didn't seem to be a loss. This was a very special battle, especially when the two sides hadn't even fought each other, but the direction of the battle had already been decided. The fierce battle attracted the attention of passing cultivators, and two half-immortals passed by. Because of the crazy gathering of resentment of the spiritual bodies, they were attracted to see what was going on. Then they left, and no one reached out to help. When the interior half-immortal saw that it was an exterior half-immortal, he didn't even think and turn around to leave. The exterior half-immortal left half a sentence. "I'll call for help." Originally, the cultivation world was a cold circle. If 3 cultivators quarreled and fought because of their own grievances and attracted a huge amount of resentment of the spiritual bodies, then they were courting their own deaths. No one would put themselves in danger. Not to mention the huge risk, even if they really rescued a few people, they might not be able to escape. The situation was in a stalemate, and the 3 of them were slowly dragged into the abyss. This was because no one wanted to be the first to leave. That would mean that their movements would attract the concentrated attacks of the spiritual bodies. Ding Shan's heart was neither worried nor happy. He had thought of his end, but he hadn't thought it would end like this. At the very least, he tried. This was the first time in his life that he had encountered such an outcome. He could only sigh at the impermanence of life. What was yours. Stealing and robbing seemed to be useless. It was also at this time that another unfamiliar half-immortal came. He didn't leave immediately like the previous 2, nor did he take a closer look. Instead, he looked back and forth at the empty divine magic conch with great interest, as if he was very confused. After observing for a while, he wobbled his way to a safe distance away from the battle. Seeing that the 3 of them were in a dangerous situation, he felt at ease. Since he did not speak, Ding Shan did not open his mouth to plead either. This was because this was another so-called evildoer with a cultivation of primordial spirit. It was just that they did not know whether he was in the interior or the exterior realm. But Li Fan Thimble was very nervous. They had been in the small circle of exterior realm evildoers for many years and knew most of the exterior realm evildoers. This person was so unfamiliar, and from his appearance, he seemed to be slightly similar to that person in the legends. He was very nervous and did not dare to ask, nor did he have the ability to easily escape. In recent years, a new star had risen among the 2 heavens half-immortals. Though he was definitely not as good as some second severance, 4th or 5th severance, his cruel and ruthless methods of doing things, as well as the fact that he had a large group of followers, caused every half-immortal to have misgivings. He was definitely not the strongest half-immortal, but as the strongest evildoer and the leader of a new force in the change of the previous era, his position was very clear and unquestionable. Then, was it this person or not? This person just watched quietly from the side, not speaking, and did not have any inclination. Ding Shan also felt the pressure from this person's silence. Just standing there quietly, he could clearly feel that the 2 half-immortals had begun to make slight mistakes when dealing with the countless resentful spiritual bodies. Being surrounded by the spiritual bodies as well, his feeling could not be wrong. He had to be an important figure, but Ding Shan did not think that this would definitely be beneficial to him, because he, too, had his own selfish thoughts. He sighed in his heart. If a cultivator could not hold on to himself, he would fall into such a predicament, not daring to speak in front of a true elite because he felt guilty. Thimble's divine sense told him, "Fellow cultivator Ding, there are outsiders spying on us. Their intentions are unclear, and their origins are unclear. I fear that an accident will happen, and the three of us will fall here without knowing why. Why don't we each take a step back? The three of us will each flee separately, and what happens after will depend on the will of the heavens. Ding Shan's heart was slightly moved. To be honest, his current magic power reserves had already reached the edge of the danger line. If he wasted a little more time, not to mention whether he could deal with the attacks of others, just these resentful spiritual bodies would be able to take his life. Even ants would drag out their lives, let alone humans. If there was such an opportunity, everyone would flee separately and save their lives. Everything else could be discussed later. But was it really like this? Thousands of years of cultivation experience made him not think simply. Though his battle prowess was indeed limited, to be able to cultivate to his current level, he naturally had his own unique points. I think it's very good now. Continuing to waste time like this is much more interesting than cooperating with the two of you. The two evildoers were secretly annoyed. This person was stubborn. He had made up his mind that even if he died, he would drag them along with him. With a touch of divine sense, they had already made a decision. As a half-immortal, the foundation of the way of battle was to control the situation by oneself. It was impossible to let one's own magic power be consumed to the point of being at the mercy of others. Moreover, this person might not necessarily be that demon god. The two of them made a decision and began to prepare to flee. When dealing with the resentful spiritual bodies around them, there were some slight changes. This was a process that required careful consideration. How not to take away too many spiritual bodies, how to gradually get rid of the siege of the spiritual bodies, and how to transfer the spiritual bodies' attacks to others when someone obstructed them. At this moment, a wandering spiritual body floated to the side of the cultivator who was quietly watching the fun. He only felt a flash of light, and the spiritual body turned into nothingness. At the same time, a flying sword floated and hovered beside the cultivator. The cultivator opened his mouth lazily, and when everyone thought he was going to speak, they didn't expect that the flying sword would drill into his mouth to pick his teeth. Thimblely Fan's heart trembled. This was terrible. Chapter 1990. They could basically confirm that this was the villain. This discovery caused the duo's plan to fail because they had to consider the possibility of being attacked by the flying swords in the process of leaving. With their strength on the flying swords, it would be difficult for them to deal with it under normal circumstances, not to mention dragging along so many vengeful spirit bodies. They also didn't consider whether the swordsman knew that they were one of the 100 or so demigods that were wanted. Similar guesses had been tormenting them for a long time, and now it seemed that this was the worst-case scenario. What should they do? The two were in a desperate situation. Dingshan wasn't cooperating with them. The swordsman was threatening them from the outside, and the endless vengeful spirits were harassing them endlessly. They had to take action. Every second they wasted would weaken their elemental energy. They could only rush out and hope that the swordsman wouldn't be able to attack them both at the same time. Actually, if the two were really close friends, one would sacrifice his life to attract the attack, and the other would have a chance to escape. But this referred to the attitude of taking responsibility and treating life and death as nothing. If Lu Xiaoyi and his friends were here, they could all do this. Some would sacrifice their lives to delay the enemy, and some would swear that they wouldn't leave even if they died. Instead, they could open up the situation or at least drag the swordsman into the siege of the vengeful spirits. But Thimble and Li Fan weren't. Husband and wife were birds in the same forest, but in the face of disaster, they flew separately. Although they were both wanted criminals and had some friendship, it was still far from a friendship of life and death. They were just huddling together for warmth. When faced with a choice between life and death, how could they sacrifice themselves to help their friends? They had to leave immediately, so there was only one choice. The two of them left at the same time, and the swordsman's attack would depend on luck. The plan was set, and they recovered their decisiveness as demigods. Looking for an opportunity, the two of them worked together and cast Spirit Storm at the same time. Tao Realm cultivators were very picky when it came to the use of vengeful spirits. The Tao Realm cultivators had very limited methods to deal with these spirits. After all, not everyone was as knowledgeable as Lu Xiaoyi. The Spirit Storm was a very smart choice. It did not focus on destroying the vengeful spirits. Instead, it pushed them as far away as possible and spread them all over the normal space. Anyone who attacked them would be attacked by these spirits. Like a snowflake floating in the void, snowflakes covered the void. No matter if it was a forbidden technique or a flying sword, it was impossible to pass through them without causing them to react. At the same time, the two freaks flew off in different directions. For the time being, they couldn't use their spatial abilities because the significance of the spiritual storm was that the snowflakes would fill the entire battlefield, including their surroundings. Under the entanglement of these spiritual bodies, no one could free themselves to use their troublesome spatial abilities. It was also at this moment that the two of them fully revealed their plans. They all wanted their companions to attract the attention of the swordsman, while they took advantage of the situation from the other side. The direct result of this was that the originally smooth escape technique had been artificially slowed down by a sliver, and the actions of their two opponents magnified the consequences of their sluggishness to the extreme. Dingshan instinctively made the most correct response. He did not try to attack the two of them. On the contrary, he took the risk of entering the embryonic breathing state the moment the spirit storm rolled up. He lowered his aura as a half-immortal cultivator to the lowest. Even if there were still spiritual bodies attacking him, he would not resist and would only passively endure them. His goal was very clear. After the spirit storm, the vengeful spirits would enter a frenzied state and attack the living beings they deemed as the most threatening. If he could lower his aura to the lowest level and make these spiritual bodies focus their attention on the two half-immortal monsters, then it would be a success. It would mean that the two of them had attracted the aggro of all the vengeful spirits on the battlefield. This was a risk because the remaining spiritual bodies could possibly cause fatal damage to him if he did not fight back. The swordsman also made a slight move, and the flying sword drilled out of his mouth. They all knew that this flying sword could change into 1,000 forms in the next moment, and 1,000 forms could change into 100,000 forms. A million swords river would be the reaper of death. As half-immortals, they were very familiar with the swordsman's attack method. Once the sword river arrived, it would be a matter of life and death. They were half-immortals, and there was no chance for them to be reborn. Under such pressure, Thimble and Li Fan immediately reacted instinctively. They activated their Tao realm and used all their defensive methods. What a joke if they did not immediately use their defensive methods after the swordsman attacked. Then they would be courting death. Even if the two of them did not know who the swordsman's main target was, they still did not know. Or perhaps both of them. However, the flying sword did not split apart like they expected. It was still a single sword, and it swayed in front of the Taoist. The Taoist stretched out his hand and began to manicure his nails. What the hell? Giving birth is not giving birth, but scaring people for fun. The swordsman did not attack, and Dingshan calmed his breathing. However, this did not mean that there was no danger. The after effect of the spiritual storm was that once the spiritual bodies were blown away, they would attack even more ferociously, especially when the two of them slowed down a little. And in order to defend against the flying sword, they arranged a large defensive formation, and Dingshan's perfect timing of holding his breath with all these factors combined. The two monsters were like two large lanterns in the wilderness in the middle of the night, attracting countless mosquitoes and insects. Their escape failed. Not long after, the two of them were surrounded by different spiritual bodies. This time, the two of them did not choose to gather together, because they had already lost their trust in each other. Different from before, this time, the attacks of the resentful spiritual bodies were even more aggressive and frenzied. Each of them was surrounded by thousands of spiritual bodies. This was a scene that tested the strength of a cultivator. Ding Shan let out a long breath. He had suffered some injuries, but it did not affect his foundation. Fortunately, the spiritual bodies around him were attracted by the two monsters. At least for the time being, he was safe. His mana reserves were on the brink of danger, but he did not dare to leave just yet. It was not because of the two exterior monsters who could not even take care of themselves, but because of the swordsman who had already started to manicure his toenails. In the void, any normal person would not take off their shoes and socks, except for the perverts. He found it strange. If this manicure process was reversed, it did not seem to be a big deal to this kind of person. Throughout the course of the battle, he could vaguely guess the identity of the swordsman. If it were someone else, it would be impossible for them to force the two exterior monsters to this extent. They did not even say a word, nor did they attack. They just quietly watched as they slid into the abyss. Being experienced in the ways of the world, he knew what to say. Otherwise, the two of them would not keep his secret. I am Ding Shan, an exterior master. I am here only to steal the treasure. Before the treasure is in my hands, I have brought disaster upon myself. If there is punishment, I will accept it. Chapter 1991. Lu Xiaoyi smiled faintly and declined to comment. It was probably a dog-eat-dog situation, but the problem was that there were two dogs on his blacklist. He still remembered the wanted list of half-immortals, but it didn't match the names of the people, and the wanted list didn't have any pictures or portraits attached to it. The announcement at that time was more like a show to show his attitude, and he didn't really want to work hard to hunt down the criminal. Among the three exterior heavenly half-immortals, Ding Shan was a traditional third decay half-immortal, while the other two were exterior heavenly half-immortal freaks. Even among the thousands of heavenly half-immortal freaks, it was hard for him to distinguish between the two that he wanted to deal with, so the actual situation wasn't as terrifying as Li Fan imagined. If he was magnanimous, he might just let it pass. This was a typical case of having a guilty conscience. As a result, he had put himself in such an awkward situation. Ding Shan didn't care about anything else. He knew very well that his plan had completely failed. Even if he could go back and restore his cultivation, he couldn't come back to steal the treasure. The news had been leaked, and his identity couldn't withstand the exterior heavenly half-immortal's fury of the masses. If this person didn't speak, he couldn't move. This was his feeling. He didn't want to move, but he wanted to see what would happen to those two monsters. Maybe he could even see the famous sword Qi Long River. Thimble and Li Fan were in a desperate situation, and the resentment of the spiritual bodies formed a big net, firmly trapping the two of them. The battle was unusually fierce. For a half-immortal, dealing with one or two spiritual bodies was a basic ability. If one could not retreat under the siege of dozens of spiritual bodies, then one was strong. No one would choose to fight head-on. Retreating under the siege of hundreds of spiritual bodies was also the ability of a strong person. Of course, it didn't matter whether it was dozens of spiritual bodies or hundreds of them, because you could only come into contact with dozens of spiritual bodies at the same time. There were more spiritual bodies, and it was a test of a cultivator's endurance and ability to burst out continuously. Both Thimble and Li Fan were geniuses of the exterior. Their strength was not bad, and they could barely be called experts. They could still hold on for a while when dealing with the spiritual bodies of resentment. Dozens of spiritual bodies were destroyed one after another, but the problem was that they couldn't escape from the encirclement of the spiritual bodies. Dozens of spiritual bodies were killed, but soon there were other spiritual bodies to replace them. They kept killing and being replaced. Because of the sluggishness of the spirit bodies, they couldn't escape, and they didn't have time or space abilities. These spirit bodies grasped the space close to where he was, and, under the strong disturbance, there was no chance to open a space passage. He could only slowly flee and kill until he could no longer sustain the huge consumption of energy. This was the most classic way for exterior and exterior stoneskins to die on the wall of mirrors. He wasn't killed by some powerful spiritual entity, but by exhaustion. In the cultivation world, this was the most tragic way to die. because you don't even have the chance to perish together with your opponent. Who would you perish together with? Was it related to these instinctive resentment spirits? There were still thousands of spiritual bodies surrounding them. If they continued to kill at this pace, they would be wiped out in another hour. But they certainly couldn't hold on until that moment, not even half of them. Ding Shan's trap was very ruthless. He brought into full play the experience of an old cultivator of thousands of years. Of course, if it weren't for the appearance of the swordsman, he wouldn't have achieved his goal. He might even have lost himself. He sighed with emotion. It seems that they can't escape from the tight encirclement of the spiritual bodies. Lu Xiaoyi smiled gently. Escape from encirclement? No, they've fallen into the encirclement. In the struggle, Thimble was the first to make a dying struggle. Risking his body injury, he performed the secret technique of body swap and approached the two culprits in the continuous super teleportation. It was a choice that he had no other choice. The best result would be that the two people who were watching the show would dodge, which would cause some of the spiritual and physical bodies to shift their targets to the two human beings. This didn't solve much of the problem, because Thimble's final burst was still the strongest source of gravity. It was still the spiritual body's first choice of attack. But because the spiritual bodies on the periphery couldn't attack close in, they would choose other targets in their berserk state. If they were lucky, a small portion of them would shift their target, but they might not be able to cause much trouble for the two people. But when people were about to die, they could always pull as many people as they could, even if it was just to create some insignificant trouble for their opponents. Li Fan immediately worked together. At this point in the battle, the two friends who were hostile towards each other finally reached a tacit understanding before death. But it was a bit late. He also burst out with the power of his bloodline and burned his potential. He didn't care about the future. He only wanted to drag these two despicable, scheming men into it. After they died, he would let the spiritual bodies continue their berserk state and add it to the two new targets. He had to admit that although the possibility wasn't high, it was still a desperate move. As the two monsters were willing to sacrifice themselves to burst out with their strongest attacks, the spiritual bodies on the battlefield once again went berserk. As long as the two bystanders made the slightest movement and revealed their aura, there would definitely be spiritual bodies nearby attacking them. The commotion caused by one person might not be enough to truly trap the two, but if Thimble and Li Fan moved together, the probability of this happening would undoubtedly be much higher. These two monsters were using their lives to drag them down with them. Before they died, they displayed the stubbornness of cultivators who would never admit defeat. The entire battlefield became crazy. It was as if a tornado had swept up countless snowflakes. Who could do this without a single leaf touching their body? Seeing the two ferocious-looking monsters charging over with their spiritual bodies, Lu Xiaoyi's pedicure flying sword moved. It shook and once again drilled into his mouth to pick his teeth, but he turned a blind eye to the swarm of spiritual bodies that blotted out the sky. Picking his teeth wasn't the goal, but the sword was in his mouth so that the aura of the sword wouldn't be revealed. Ding Shan hesitated for a moment, unable to decide whether to run or stay. But when he saw the swordsman not moving at all, he couldn't help but calm down. It was as if the sky was collapsing in front of him. There was a mountain peak nearby. As a result, he also didn't move at all. His aura calmed down, but his mouth was somewhat unable to hold back. Enforcer, you just finished pedicure. A large number of spiritual bodies crisscrossed around the two of them, but not a single one attacked them. Because they couldn't sense any aura, they only continued to surge towards the two large lanterns. Thimble and Li Fan roared and cursed, but no matter how they provoked them, the two bystanders turned a deaf ear and ignored them. Their only way out was to get close to the two people. However, under the fearless attacks of thousands of spiritual entities, their wish was shattered when they were only a short distance away. They really couldn't charge forward. The consequences of their previous close combat were revealed. Injuries on top of exhaustion. Their auras were weak and their bloodlines were out of balance. The spiritual bodies were like rain after a long drought. How could they easily let go of such a delicious tonic? Chapter 1992. Thousands of spiritual bodies surrounded the two demi-immortal evildoers, forming a terrifyingly dense mass. It was as if countless flies were crawling on a piece of rotten meat. This was a feast for the resentful spiritual bodies. Every spiritual body wanted a piece of the pie. This was their instinct, the source of their strength. No cultivator could withstand such an attack. Under the devouring, the spiritual consciousness of the two evildoers was completely devoured. Only two empty shells were left. The disappearance of Tao and the emergence of heaven's desire. While Dingshan was still grieving, he felt a brilliant light rising beside him. It was the dazzling Sword River. Lunatic! If the two evildoers were still alive, it would be understandable if you wanted to kill them. However, the two of them were already dead, and their resentful spirits were currently in a state of satiation. As long as they continued to endure, these spiritual bodies would naturally disperse after a short while. Why bother provoking them? Wouldn't you be taking the initiative to achieve the two evildoers' ultimate goal of mutual destruction? The speed of the sword was extremely fast. When a light appeared, the two balls of golden light had already exploded. In terms of strategy, this might be a superfluous move. However, in terms of tactics, the excessive overlapping of the resentful spiritual bodies caused them to restrain each other in an uncoordinated manner. In the two balls of golden light, thousands of spiritual bodies were instantly vaporized. Dingshan could feel the complicated changes in the Tao realm. Moreover, it was a Tao realm that targeted the spiritual bodies. He knew that he couldn't do this even if his spiritual bodies were so concentrated. This was a huge gap in combat power. The explosive power of the swordsman was vividly displayed in this attack. The resentful spiritual bodies were also afraid. Their instincts told them that there must be someone they couldn't afford to offend when such a large number of their kind disappeared. Therefore, the remaining stragglers scattered and disappeared in an instant. I allowed the two evildoers to be devoured because they deserved to die. I destroyed these spiritual bodies because they killed human cultivators. These are two different concepts. They can't be confused. Dingshan was silent. In front of such a person, he couldn't summon any thoughts of resistance. The Sword River had seen it, but it also extinguished the last trace of hope in his heart. The two demi-immortal evildoers paid the price for their actions. What about him? In front of this interior enforcer who was rumored to be fair and strict, how should he deal with his theft? Should he die to atone for his crime? In any case, he hadn't succeeded yet. Lu Xiaoyi looked at him. These people's disputes could not be hidden from him, but the details were missing. He walked around the empty divine magic conch a few times with great interest. Yes, this thing is embedded in the positioning system, and it's an important node. What do you plan to do if you want to do it? Dingshan had no choice but to take out his fake and demonstrate it to the enforcer. He wanted to be caught doing something bad and have to identify the crime scene. It was very humiliating, but he had no other choice. Lu Xiaoyi carefully observed the difference between the genuine and the fake. He couldn't help but sigh. Good technique. If one did not look closely at it, one could almost mistake it for the real thing. Those two fellows are quite capable as well. They could tell at a glance that you were cheating, but I was completely confused. Dingshan was embarrassed. The two of them had something in mind and came for this. Now that I have the twin conches, it's easy to be noticed. If I take one of them, even if it's the real one, it won't be that easy to be noticed. The enforcer is focused on the great Tao, and his sword skills are unparalleled. Of course, he wouldn't spend any effort on the Tao of artifacts. In the end, in front of his own strength, how can the Tao of artifacts be refined? Dingshan was flattering. For a third decay cultivator who had lived for thousands of years, this was the greatest extent he could bend his back. No one could understand why a cultivator would be so cautious in front of a junior who was thousands of years younger than him. In fact, this was also a part of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi did not sympathize with him. After observing the two spiritual treasures for a while, He reached out and took the real one. Ding Shan wanted to stop him, but did not dare to. Was he just going to take it down and play with it? In the next moment, this enforcer loose stuffed the empty divine conch into his storage ring. Only then did he realize that although this lord was an official to the outside, he was also a thief in reality. But he took it down in front of him. Was he going to kill him next? But this enforcer's next move puzzled him. He took out a strand of qi and twisted it. A white light rose, and the smoke split into three. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. This empty divine conch was sealed in the storage ring, but could not prevent the aura from locking onto it. He was experimenting to see if he could erase the direction of this spiritual treasure in the aura provided by the Grand Monarch. This was a necessary safety precaution. The space here was reversed, left and right, up and down, front and back could not be distinguished. After an intense battle, his spatial perception would be messed up, and he might make a mistake in determining which of the three branches was which. The best way was to take one of them away. This way, he only needed to choose between two directions, and it would be much easier. He really did not know much about artifacts. The cultivation world was all-encompassing, and different professions were worlds apart. There were many things that he could not understand in a short period of time. After calculating in his mind, he turned around and looked at Ding Shan, who wanted to say something but was hesitating. He asked, "My smoke is split into three branches. Do you understand?" Ding Shan was very cautious. He felt that this enforcer was not simply stealing treasures. Thus, he guessed, the smoke split into three branches should be pointing to the three spiritual treasures on the wall of mirrors. But I don't know which one the enforcer is looking for. Or, do you want to catch all of them in one go? Lu Xiaoyi could not be bothered to explain that this unlucky state thought that he was in the same profession as him. You've been here for many years. Do you have any judgment? Ding Shan knew that this was a very crucial choice. Either the future was unpredictable or he would wallow in the mire. In front of his life, he decisively chose to wallow in the mire. The three branches point to the hiding places of three spiritual treasures. But I actually only know two. One is this empty divine magic conch, and the other is the lamp-extinguishing lamp in the other direction. As for the third direction, it should have appeared not many years ago and is in the depths of the mirror of mirrors. Few people know about it. I only vaguely know a thing or two because I specialize in this field and chatted with friends in the same profession. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while and asked shamelessly, "The smoke is split into three branches and points to different directions. How do you differentiate between them? Can fellow Taoists teach me?" At this point, Ding Shan naturally would not hide anything. Thus, he explained in detail. In the eyes of an artifact expert like him, many things gradually became clear under his analysis. He was no longer as confused and foolish as before. Every profession had its own specialization. No one was a know-it-all. Chapter 1993. After the explanation, Lu Xiaoyi, a layman, finally understood the basic knowledge of spiritual treasures. This was not knowledge from ancient books, but the lifetime achievement of an old man who had studied spiritual treasures for thousands of years. Lu Xiaoyi nodded in satisfaction. With Ding Shan's help, some of his previous doubts were resolved. He could begin to track down the target of the mission. There was still no news from Heaven's Eye, which meant that the bamboo hat had not been obtained yet. Was this good news or bad news? He stuffed the empty divine magic conch into Ding Shan's hand and asked, "I heard that you're only borrowing it for a period of time. Is that true?" Ding Shan told the truth. "It's true, but I can't guarantee that I won't change my mind after using it. But now, with the enforcer here, how could I have any thoughts of taking it for myself?" Lu Xiaoyi nodded. "Then take it and use it. But remember your promise. After all, it's public property. You can borrow it, but you can't use it as a personal weapon." Ding Shan was a little confused. "I can understand why the enforcer doesn't care about it, but I'm still stealing." Lu Xiaoyi sighed. There's a saying of stealing in the cultivation world. Whoever has the ability to take it is the right thing to do. Spirit treasures are meant to be used by people. Otherwise, they're just decorations. But there's also a bottom line under power. Back then, who put the spirit treasure here for the convenience of all the cultivators who came for the mirror examination mission? Their breadth of mind is admirable. Even if we can't do the same, we should at least continue this tradition. Only then can we live up to our original intentions. It's also the strength that supports us. Ding Shan blushed with shame. Before the effect of the fake disappears, the empty divine magic conch will definitely return to its original place. It doesn't matter if I've used it or not. This poor Taoist can't help you this time. It's really beyond my ability. But there's one thing that you can actually borrow. Lu Xiaoyi floated away. With your guidance, I've avoided many detours. This is already a great help. This time his goal was firm. It was the direction of the deepest part of the wall of mirrors. He had been in here for less than a year, and his elemental force cultivation was still at 90%. There was no need for him to go out and recover. The environment here had something to do with the refinement of the cultivator's elemental energy. For a cultivator like him, who pursued purity and not thickness, he would have a slight advantage in terms of attenuation. Most importantly, he didn't want to drag this mission out for too long. In the depths of the mirror, a figure was still moving deeper and deeper. As the man in the bamboo hat moved forward, he silently observed his position. He found that his current position was far beyond the coverage of the system of road signs in the mirror. He could still find the way back, but if he moved forward or encountered a fierce battle, it would be hard to say. Most importantly, if you couldn't find the correct way back, the mirror's energy extraction would continue. Sooner or later, you would become a raft that had lost its power. You would drift aimlessly in the void until all of your energy was sucked out. You would become nothing more than a piece of human skin. In the wall of mirrors, there were many half-immortals who died like this, and if one was lucky enough, one could even witness it with one's own eyes. But he had to go, because this was his karma. Having received benefits from celestial elder Wu Hua, he naturally had to clean up the old man's mess. Furthermore, he had to clean up in front of that swordsman, a two-person mission. He was very dissatisfied that heavens, I had chosen this kind of companion for him. If it weren't for the fact that he was now a second severance, he wouldn't even have accepted this kind of mission, although they were both primordial spirit, and he had taken 2 steps, while the swordsman had only taken 1 step. The swordsman's killing ability made him feel no sense of security at all. This wasn't cowardice, but rather the time wasn't right. There were many ways to fight for victory, and battle was only one of them. He didn't like this kind of method. He preferred more cultivation methods, and this was also the biggest characteristic of the Silence sect. Silence, a rope to tie things up. From a name to the meaning, it was to speak less and do more. The Silence sect wasn't sealing their own mouths, nor was it sealing people's mouths. It represented a kind of ideology, advocating that it was better to be a short E with words than a giant with actions. The word silent itself had nothing to do with the characteristics of the cultivation technique. It didn't mean that they wouldn't speak after chanting incantations and casting techniques. After taking 2 steps, he could clearly feel his own improvement in the concept of Tao level. Previously, his understanding of Tao level was already very deep, but now he had a feeling of creating a new level, as if he was the founder of some sect. He was very clear about the significance of this feeling. When he took the 3rd step, it would be the moment when he reconstructed regulations. This time would definitely be the moment when the epoch changed, because only at that moment would the universe allow new regulations to be born. Before making sufficient preparations, he still had a very important step to take, and that was to advance to Yang God. This was the cornerstone, and he still had time. Different from taking a few steps, this was a real work of patience. There were no shortcuts, and he wouldn't take shortcuts. When he should jump, and when he should be steady, this was the most basic sense of propriety. As for Tao level, he was now still in a kind of continuous sublimation stage. In the fall of immortal Wu Hua, He had obtained great benefits from the innate 5 manifestations. But for the other innate Daos he had grasped, such sublimation still required him a long time to polish. Like the swordsman, his goal was also to master all 36 innate Daos. However, Lu Xiaoyi could only master one Dao after breaking one, because of the uniqueness of the small universe in his body when he ascended to nascent soul. He was different. The Daos he grasped had nothing to do with the shattering of Daos. It was completely dependent on his own accumulation. He had his own secrets, and also had the most suitable path for him. To him, the reason he could reach this step was because of the great responsibility bestowed upon him by the heavens. Every time he comprehended Daos, he would be able to advance at lightning speed, advancing 1,000 miles in a day, gaining frequent epiphanies. This was because he had a great ambition, and his ambition was in accordance with a certain will of the heavenly Tao. The content was that after the epoch changed, the existing 36 Daos would remain unchanged. Such a wish was even more difficult than creating a new innate Tao. This was because as the universe and heaven and earth changed, the changes in the 36 innate Daos were already set in stone. The only thing he didn't know was which Tao would leave the stage of history, and which new Tao would appear. His mission was to stop all of this, to maintain the current order of Daos after the epoch changed. Who was the one who planted this karma in him? Was it really his own ambition, or was it induced by some existence? These things were no longer important to consider now. In a great change in the universe, if there was a reformist, there would definitely be a conservative. These were the two sides of the same coin. The cornerstone of the universe's smooth transition, an indispensable counterbalance force. He just happened to occupy the conservative side. Stemming from his own orthodoxy, there was no distinction between good and bad. These 36 Daos have been formed in the universe for millions of years, proving their rationality. Since that was the case, why did they have to change? If they changed, would they still be able to persist for millions of years? Millions of years, not only to the mortal world, but also to the cultivation world. It was a very long time, proving the excellence of this system. Chapter 1994. The bamboo hat traversed through the silent void, thinking about his own matters. How far a cultivator could go depended on how far he could see. If one were to fuss over petty benefits, disputes over orthodoxies and grudges, one's achievements would be very limited. In the inner and outer realm, there weren't many real threats that he could see. Of course, he couldn't control everything. There were many people in the universe who didn't walk the normal path and kept a low profile. There were many paths to the upper realm, and for each person, there wasn't a path that two people could walk on. If one wanted to stand out during the era change, one had to be different from others. There was only one person who had a competitive relationship with him. Furthermore, his actions in the past few years had also brought him a lot of pressure. That swordsman, Lu Xiaoyi. From the moment he knew of this person, he had vaguely regarded him as his opponent. As time passed, his view was gradually verified. There were some changes within. In the beginning, his competitive instincts towards the swordsman stopped at the superficial understanding that they both cultivated the 36 innate Daos. But later, as the swordsman's performance in the inner and outer realms increased, he discovered something deeper. Cultivating the 36 innate Daos at the same time was only a small conflict, a competition between individuals. There was an even bigger and more irreconcilable conflict between them. If the bamboo hat represented the conservative faction that completed the unchanging innate Daos, then the swordsman represented the reformist faction. He was destined to reform the innate Daos. Under such a premise, there was no room for reconciliation between the two sides, let alone coexisting. If Lu Xiaoyi succeeded, the 36 innate Daos would be increased, decreased, and renewed. Then the bamboo hat would die without a burial ground. If he succeeded, the 36 innate Daos would remain unchanged after the change of epochs. Lu Xiaoyi and the other cultivators who tried to overthrow the tradition would be completely wiped out. This was the truth of the Battle of Daos. It was cruel, but it was a necessary process for the universe to change. It was because of this understanding that he knew that only one of them would have a future together with the swordsman. He also knew that his way of defeating this person wasn't just through battle. However, this kind of mission had forced the two of them together. This was why he disliked Heaven's Eyes. This wasn't a coincidence. It was intentional. He did not know what this represented, but it was nothing more than the filth and intrigue of the upper realm. He knew very well that he was just a chess piece, but a chess piece had its own value. There were millions of cultivators in the universe, and being able to be a chess piece in this universe represented one's ability. There were risks, but there were also rewards. It was much better than being a spectator. He had such awareness, but he didn't know if that sword cultivator had the same awareness. If he was a one-track-minded killer, then he would be in big trouble. To be able to create such a huge commotion in the inner and outer scenic skies, one couldn't be a fool. He hoped that the final battle between the two of them would be dragged to the last moment before the end of the era, and not decided to fight to the death right now. It was meaningless to decide the victor now. If the swordsman died, the heavenly axiom would definitely find another opponent for him. If he died, the heavenly axiom would find another enemy for the swordsman. There was no end to it. After flying like this for nearly 3 years, he finally felt that he was close to the target area. At this time, his cultivation base had already dropped to 80%. Don't think that this was a very high value. If he considered the return journey and then the battle, there wasn't much time left for him. He had a feeling that the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron belonged to him alone. There was a very unique place within the reflecting mirror wall. It was very deep, and you couldn't say that it was the center. It didn't have a name, and it was like a black hole that constantly rotated, sucking in everything in the deathly still space. Energy, material objects, sound, light, everything. This was why all the cultivators in the deathly still space, including the immortals, felt their essence, chi, and spirit leaking out of their bodies uncontrollably. There were many such black holes in the universe, big and small. Many of them had very strong suction forces, but at least the cultivators could feel it from very far away. They could keep their distance and restrain their inner secrets so that they wouldn't be sucked away. The difference between this place and the outside universe was that it wasn't the cultivator's body that was attracted, but the energy in their body. One could choose not to come, but if one came, they would have to bear with it. Inside the wall of mirrors, the spiritual treasures were an exception, especially the innate spiritual treasures. They were the only species in the universe that could rely on themselves to resist this kind of suction. That was why there was still the empty divine magic conch and the flickering lamp. That was why they were the fulcrum of the entire coordinate system of the wall of mirrors. That was why they were so important, and all the cultivators who came here carefully guarded them. That was why the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron came here to hide. The universe was vast, and there were countless dangerous places. It had also traveled to many places with immortal Wu Hua, but in terms of safety, this place was blessed by the heavens. No matter who came here, they couldn't fight a protracted battle with it. This was an instinctive choice, a self-defense mechanism, when the innate spiritual treasure first gained intelligence. The suction force here was the strongest, and the resentment spiritual bodies were the densest here. This kind of environment was a natural barrier for it to protect itself. It was a very smart choice. The bamboo hat cautiously circled around the black hole a few times. Compared to the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron, this thing posed a greater threat to him. He had to actually feel the suction force here to determine how long he could stay here. Only then could he determine his plan of action. Soon, he made a judgment in his heart. 2 years was a relatively safe limit, and 3 years was the limit. He had to leave. When he had a plan in mind, he refocused his attention on the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron floating outside the black hole like an inanimate object. The Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron floated here for 2 reasons. First, it was safe and second, it nurtured a spirit. Although its lifespan was very long, it was under the control of humans for a long period of time. For spiritual treasures, whether they were innate or acquired, the most important factor for humans to measure them was the time they gained intelligence. If they gained intelligence early, then they would definitely be a powerful spiritual treasure. If they gained intelligence late, then they would instinctively control their behavior, and there would be countless possibilities. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was more complicated. It gained intelligence very late, only a few decades ago. For existences like them, it was no different from being born. But because he also had a long experience of mingling with immortals, it was very difficult to accurately measure their abilities. It was full of uncertainty. The bamboo had already had a plan on how to deal with this pre-celestial spiritual treasure. From the moment he received this mission, he knew that using brute force would definitely not work. However, he could do something through that bit of karma with the immortal Wu Hua, moistening things silently and imperceptibly, but his imperceptibility could only last for 2 or 3 years. Chapter 1995. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was formed during the period of the 5 Grandmasters. This was the immemorial era before the chaos was formed. Immortal Elder Wu Hua chose it as his accompanying immortal cauldron in the end. It was not a random choice. It was a coincidence, but it was also inevitable. The most important thing was that it was perfectly compatible with the Tao realm. Even immortal Elder Wu Hua's Great Tao, the Leap Earth Great Tao, was formed from this cauldron. It could be seen that it played an important role in immortal Elder Wu Hua's path to immortality. After immortal Elder Wu Hua died, this heaven cauldron naturally could not be buried with him. It finally got rid of immortal Elder Wu Hua's control, gave birth to its own consciousness, and hid here. It was very difficult to determine its current level just by looking at its realm. Of course, it was definitely not an immortal cauldron. The immortal world would not allow an immortal's immortal lattice to be replaced by something close to him after his death. However, it would not fall too low. After all, this was something immortals used to rely on. It was very difficult to determine how to identify it. Did this Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron have more intelligence, or was it the hidden consciousness of immortal Elder Wu Hua? This would take a long time. So long that even a human half-immortal might not be able to outlast it. Bamboo Hat naturally would not choose such a stupid method. The task of the Heavenly Eyes was unclear. What he wanted to do was to think of the worst-case scenario. Therefore, killing it was actually the most rational thing to do. The least he could do was to not leave any future troubles and also cut off the karma that might affect his future upper realm. Keeping this thing would be troublesome in the end. How could one completely destroy a connate numinous treasure? At their level, it was no longer physical destruction. Cleaving in two or hammering it into pieces was meaningless. It was impossible to cause any real damage to a connate numinous treasure. If he wanted to truly destroy the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, he had to start with the Leap Earth Great Tao on the basis of Tao Realm. He had to completely deny its existence as the cornerstone of the Leap Earth Great Tao. This was the way humans fought with innate spiritual treasures of the same level. On the surface, it was very peaceful, but the danger was not inferior to a life and death battle between humans. Bamboo Hat was very clear about this point, so he would not try in vain. He would use other methods to test it. If he did not succeed, the thousands of resentful spirits here would swallow him alive. He slowly came to the side of the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. However, the connate numinous treasure seemed to have sensed nothing and remained dead silent. There was no need for it to react in any way. The tens of thousands of vengeful spirits here were its guards, and the black hole's energy extraction was its helper. What else did it need to do? The Bamboo Hat calmed his mind and slowly extended his consciousness into the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. Following the changes in the Tao state within the Heaven Cauldron, he changed his own Tao state response. Among the 5 grands, He was searching for that mysterious connection. Time passed slowly, and the changes in the bamboo hat's consciousness and Tao realm slowly began to synchronize with the changes in the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. At first, it was a little deliberate and lagged behind, but after a while, it quietly reached a wonderful resonance point. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron still didn't change, but the man in the hat started to become illusory. In the end, he disappeared. It was as if he had never existed. This was an ability of the second Severance Cultivator. They could transform into a being of the Tao tier and abandon their mortal body. The greatest significance of doing this was that they could use their Tao tier ability to the greatest extent and did not need to transmit their Tao tier through some kind of move like ordinary half-immortals. There were many benefits, and this was manifested here. It would not trigger the restlessness of the countless vengeful spirits in the surroundings. No matter what he did, it would be inside the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, and he would avoid the greatest embarrassment of being a human cultivator, being attacked by spirits. The most important benefit was that he could cleverly avoid encountering that partner of his who was on the same mission as him. Towards Lu Xiaoyi, he had always been very unsure. He seemed very fierce, but also seemed to know how to rope people in, which was the real him. Only by coming into contact with him would he know. Regrettably, they had heard of each other for a long time, but had never really come into contact with each other, and had even become great enemies in this kind of situation where they had never come into contact with each other. Now that he had transformed into a Tao tier cultivator and was hiding inside the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, he had a chance to observe this person's way of doing things from a close distance. His true cultivation level of Tao tier. With this as the basis, he would then decide what to do. They could join forces, they could pretend to be ignorant, they could be strangers, and they could also make a move in secret. He would not come up with a plan in advance. Everything would be decided on the spot, and that was the most brilliant strategy. Of course, there would be losses for every gain. The greatest harm of merging his body into the Tao tier was that if he lost this contest of Tao tier, his whole person would become nourishment for the Tao tier and be absorbed by the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. There were also some minor problems. For example, he would lose his sight, ears, body, tongue, and nose. Using the extreme divine sense Tao tier to replace the other 5 senses of the 6 senses, there would be losses for every gain. This was the rule of any kind of Tao technique. This kind of method could be said to be fighting to live from the brink of death, but as an outstanding half-immortal freak, he had this kind of confidence and would not avoid this kind of danger. He was the bamboo hat, the person chosen by the heavenly Tao to maintain the old order. In this kind of Tao tier state, he appeared to be very at ease, advancing and retreating as he pleased. He was not in a hurry to deal with this Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, even if he actually already had some confidence. If he could use this innate spiritual treasure to achieve other additional goals, wouldn't it be wonderful? Time passed quietly in this kind of waiting. Around the black hole, everything was as usual. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was still lifeless, and countless resentful spiritual bodies were like dense seaweed in the shallow sea. The energy from the entire wall of mirrors was still steadily converging towards the black hole, just like the rhythm of millions of years. A year later, the bamboo hat sensed an indescribable aura approaching and knew that it was coming. He could not help but hide his Tao tier fluctuations even more, as if it was a part of the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron's own Tao tier circulation. This kind of invisibility technique was indeed very high-end. As long as the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was there, no one would be able to detect that there was a human here. It did not matter if one was looking, smelling, or touching. As long as the bamboo hat did not use his Tao tier control, he would be invisible. It was a very strange feeling. It was indeed an unfamiliar aura approaching, but it gave the bamboo hat a strange feeling, as if it was not a human. He had never come into contact with Lu Xiaoyi, so he was not clear about the characteristics of this person's aura. However, from a conventional point of view, swordsman, sharp, aggressive, that was more or less the case. Lu Xiaoyi was very special, but some essential things would not change. However, in his Tao tier perception, he did not feel the aura of a swordsman. This was very abnormal. However, he did not lie. He would not take the initiative to strengthen his Tao tier perception, because that would expose himself. Instead, he let nature take its course and waited for this inexplicable thing to approach. One fact was that when Liu Cheng stirred shit up, you would never be able to figure out how he did it. Was it to the side? Was it to the bottom? The universe was as vast as a circle, and there was a rod in the middle. Spinning in the right direction was to beat the starch, and spinning in the wrong direction was to stir the starch. Chapter 1996. When it approached a certain distance, the bamboo hat used his Tao realm perception to discover that it was another connate numinous treasure that was approaching him. Of course, he could only sense it with his Tao realm. Since he no longer had a body, he no longer had eyes, nose, tongue, and ears before entering the wall of reflection. He was not completely clueless about the situation in the mirror realm. This was a necessary precaution for a half-immortal cultivator. For example, the situation of the inner and outer scenic heaven half-immortals, their range of activities, the nature of their missions. Of course, he also knew the coordinates of the mirror realm. He also knew the two most important points in this coordinate system, the two connate spiritual treasures. Empty divine magic conch and light extinguishing lamp seem to be these two names. The one that came should be the empty divine magic conch. The bamboo hat knew a little about how spiritual treasures interacted with each other. As the saying goes, a mountain cannot have two tigers, unless one is male and the other is female. In the universe, this rule also existed. For spiritual treasures, it was standard for a connate spiritual treasure to guard a universe. There might be multiple universes with one connate spiritual treasure, but there had never been multiple connate spiritual treasures in a universe. Taisu, Heaven and Earth Chessboard, Ruins of End, Tao Wu, Big Tree, and some are all like this. Of course, this was for connate spiritual treasures. Artificial spiritual treasures were not included. In the cultivation world, it was common knowledge that a universe could only have one connate spiritual treasure. Of course, this referred to those connate spiritual treasures that had gained sentience. Chaotic spiritual treasures were not included. The mirror realm could also be seen as a universe. Therefore, there should only be one connate spiritual treasure that had gained sentience. That was why the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron came here. It ignored the other two connate spiritual treasures that had not gained sentience. But the problem now was, what if the two connate spiritual treasures in the mirror realm had gained sentience by coincidence? Who should have a right to guard this mirror realm? Were they the ones who stayed here longer? Or should they have a stronger background? Or should they be stronger? There was no uniform rule. If they were all under the heavenly eye system, Lord Numinous Treasure would come out to mediate. But if they were all spiritual treasures that were not part of the system, this was the bamboo hat's guess of the entire process. It had to be said that it was too coincidental. The Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron gained sentience came here, and then one of the two connate spiritual treasures in the mirror realm had gained sentience. Could there be humans secretly meddling in this? What was his goal? Did he have anything to do with the swordsman? This was the crux of the problem. He wasn't sure, so he could only observe quietly. While observing, he would find an opportunity to see if he could find out the truth. The timing was also very coincidental. According to his calculations, the swordsman wouldn't have been too slow after receiving the Omniscient Eye quest. He definitely wouldn't have arrived as soon as he did, because he would have to choose one out of 3 options. It would be normal for him to arrive 1 or 2 years later than him. For example, the timing of the arrival of the Empyrean spirited conch. Personally, he was more inclined to believe that the swordsman was behind this. However, because he no longer had 5 of his 6 senses, he could only rely on his Tao realm to distinguish everything. He no longer had the most direct method. Using his eyes, everything seemed a little confusing. This was the joy of cultivation. When you thought you had the best response, What appeared in front of you was often the most embarrassing shortcoming. At least until now, the appearance was that the two connate spiritual treasures were fighting for supremacy in this void. One was more active, while the other was more passive. In essence, it was a question of who would stay and who would leave. Perhaps the two connate spiritual treasures were controlled by humans, but they were trying their best to pretend that they were pure spiritual treasures. Therefore, the battle between them could only be carried out in the way that the spiritual treasures were most used to. Firstly, the spiritual treasures wouldn't curse at each other. Therefore, no one spoke, and there was no communication. The spiritual treasures wouldn't bargain with each other either. Most of the time, the stronger one would stay, and the weaker one would leave. Just like now, when the Empyrean spirited conch approached, it didn't have the habits of a human cultivator. For example, it observed from afar, probed, and said a few meaningless words to test each other's strengths. It wanted to see if there were any similarities between the two Tao teachings, and if there were any connections between them. This was a problem of humans, not connate spiritual treasures. At least for now, it seemed like the spiritual treasure was coming. The spirited conch approached directly. For connate spiritual treasures of their level, if there was a battle, the distance between the Tao realms would be very far. However, in an environment like the Wall of Mirrors, the collision of the Tao realms would definitely cause chaos among the countless resentful spirits. To the spiritual treasures, this went against the foundation of their existence. Therefore, they chose to fight in close proximity. This was the nature of the spiritual treasures. At the very least, the people controlling the two spiritual treasures weren't amateurs. Their acting was very convincing. In this seemingly calm atmosphere, the two connate spiritual treasures collided. The mouth of the Empyrean spirited conch wrapped tightly around the tip of the Leap 8 Heavens cauldron. The two spiritual treasures merged into one. In an instant, the Tao realms wreaked havoc, fighting back and forth, going straight for the main point. The bamboo had still hid itself in the Tao realm. All the responses were controlled by the Leap 8 Heavens cauldron's instincts. He only sensed silently, but didn't make a move. Although the Leap 8 Heavens cauldron had always appeared lifeless, that was only to nurture a spirit. When an existence that was similarly a natural spiritual treasure challenged it, its instincts would not allow it to back down. A counterattack was inevitable. It was a fusion spiritual treasure of the 5 grand Tao realms. The transformation of the Tao realms was naturally based on the 5 grand Tao realms. In the process of the dispute, the true essence of the universe's transformation in the primordial age was fully displayed. The Empyrean spirited conch didn't come later than it in terms of lifespan. As a connate spiritual treasure, they were brothers of the same generation. However, the difference was that the spirited conch's Tao realm wasn't the 5 grand Tao realms, but the origin. The origin wasn't within the 5 grand Tao realms, but it was closely related to the 5 grand Tao realms. They supported each other's transformation. In fact, in the end, it was just a competition to see how profound the evolution of their respective realms were. This kind of competition was a typical literary competition. It was also the default way connate spiritual treasures compared with each other. It wasn't like between humans, where the goal was to kill each other. Up until now, the two spiritual treasures had performed well, perfectly interpreting the philosophy of the spiritual treasure race. Doubt came first, and competition came second. The prerequisite for such a competition was that both sides wouldn't go down a dead end. The universe was very big, and there were too many universes that could exist in. Why should they fight to the death over a piece of territory? It was because of this that the bamboo hat allowed the Leap 8 Heavens cauldron to act alone. In his opinion, with immortal Wu Hua's long teachings, how could the connate spiritual treasures of the main world compare to it in terms of Tao realm? If the spirited conch retreated in the end, then it would be a coincidence. If it didn't retreat after being defeated, then it must be the swordsman's doing. Chapter 1997. The bamboo hat was very thoughtful, But after some time, he found that his idea was too simple. The leap 8 heavens cauldrons leap earth great way was indeed profound. But the problem was that its foundation no longer existed. Wu Tai had already collapsed, and even immortal Wu Hua had died. It was obvious that there was a problem with his leap earth great way. In other words, there was no problem in the past, but now, because the change of the era was imminent, it did not conform to the situation. The problem was that the origin had not collapsed yet. The bamboo hat noticed that from the beginning, the leap 8 heavens cauldrons leap earth great way had the absolute advantage, but the empty divine magic conch was very tenacious and did not admit defeat easily. In the stalemate, it relied on the origin's great way to regain the balance bit by bit. In view of the fact that the two innate spiritual treasures had just gained intelligence, their application in the Tao realm still needed a process from unfamiliar to familiar. This was a very normal phenomenon. The instinct of the Tao realm was the cornerstone of every innate spiritual treasure. It would not be forgotten or discarded, and it would not be confused because of the birth of intelligence. However, the so-called intelligence lay in the flexible application of the Tao realm, in deducing other things from one case, in comprehending other things by analogy, in learning from small details, and in learning from small details, turning the instinct into a realm that could be improved through learning. This was the real meaning of the birth of intelligence. It was the prerequisite for the innate spiritual treasures to advance further. It was not to repeat the imprints left by the universe because of their long lives, to turn the dead Tao realm into a living Tao realm. This was intelligence. Intelligence was also divided into different levels. Just like human beings, some were born smart and some were stupid. The former was the internal decisive factor of the innate spiritual treasure strength. At least for now, the empty divine magic conch was obviously stronger than the leap 8 heavens cauldron. The bamboo hat knew very well why such a situation happened. It was not because the leap 8 heavens cauldron was born smarter than the empty divine magic conch, but because it was an innate spiritual treasure that had been affected by the outside world during its natural evolution. If the empty divine magic conch had developed intelligence naturally, its intelligence would definitely not be low. Because the leap 8 heavens cauldron had been controlled by immortal Wu Hua for millions of years, its intelligence would definitely not be high. Moreover, since heavens I suspected that the leap 8 heavens cauldron still had the remnant consciousness of immortal Wu Hua, then there must be a reason for this. Its intelligence was not high to begin with, and the consciousness of immortal Wu Hua might be mixed in with it, so it was normal for it to be weaker than a native awakened spiritual treasure like the empty divine magic conch. In this regard, ordinary people believe that immortal items were definitely stronger than other items of the same type. This kind of concept was wrong, at least not comprehensive. He still didn't move, not participating. He wouldn't easily make a move, because this was the only way to force out the dormant consciousness of immortal Wu Hua from the leap 8 heavens cauldron. Only then would he be able to find out if there was really someone behind this suspicious, empty god magic conch. If his guesses were correct, the final battle would be between the swordsman and immortal Wu Hua. That would be the perfect outcome. When the sandpiper and the clam fight, the fisherman benefits. The strategy was very old, but sometimes the older the strategy, the more feasible it was because it had withstood the test of time. This was the meaning of waiting. Lu Xiaoyi focused on using the Tao realm because he was still a primary school student who had just entered the primordial chaos realm. What the bamboo hat didn't know was that he relied heavily on the innate Tao fragments in his study of Tao, because he didn't have the talent of comprehending Tao like the bamboo hat. But without the heavenly Tao's favor and giving him the ability to comprehend Tao fragments, his study was the most normal study. But with the enhancement of the small universe in his body, he had the ability to capture Tao fragments and some other messy things. The bamboo hat guessed that his innate ability should have come from the conservative power of the three graces, and the swordsman's ability might have come from Hong Mao. This wasn't a blind guess. There was the Sword Dao tablet in the inverse space Heaven's Choice continent, and there were traces of Li Wuya. It was normal for Hong Mao, who longed for change, to take a fancy to him. Otherwise, how could a human cultivator have such an abnormal ability to comprehend Dao without the enhancement of a mighty power? It was very difficult for others to master 1 or 2 Daos, but they had mastered at least 10. This guess was very reasonable, but didn't conform to reality. At the very least, it seemed that Hong Mao didn't take a fancy to Lu Xiaoyi. He was a person who used the most ordinary method to comprehend Dao. The only thing he was strong about was his learning ability, and his learning method was excellent. Therefore, in the primordial chaos Dao realm, he was a beginner who was improving to a higher level. It was just that his improvement was very fast. This was very suitable for an innate spiritual treasure that had just gained sentience. This was also what Lu Xiaoyi was pursuing. During his discussion with Ding Shan, the old blight had given him a lot of help. When it knew that he might go to find trouble with the newly appeared innate spiritual treasure, it gave him such a suggestion, hiding in the empty divine conch and using the appearance of the innate spiritual treasure to approach. It had many benefits. The biggest benefit was that it could avoid the harassment of the resentful spirit bodies. The number of spirit bodies entrenched in the black hole in the depths of the reflection wall wasn't the same as before. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and they weren't something a human cultivator could fight against. Ding Shan's suggestion was very pertinent, especially to Lu Xiaoyi. He still had an enemy who was his companion. He was a very difficult person to deal with. Second Severance, primordial spirit, and his cultivation level was above his. It wasn't that he was afraid of this guy, but with this bamboo hat's behavior, he avoided him in everything, and probably wouldn't give him a fair chance to fight. This person's Dao heart was very different. He didn't feel ashamed of retreating, and his vision was very far. He was a good opponent who could submit and stand tall. This kind of person, it was very difficult for him to use his full strength, and it was also very difficult for him to succeed with a single strike after advancing 2 steps in cultivation level. So he needed a strategy. Ding Shan meant that he could use the fake first, and let Lu Xiaoyi take the conch to complete the mission. In any case, he couldn't leave before the mission was completed, so there was no need to collect it now. To him, he wouldn't consider the swordsman taking the treasure and not returning, either. This wasn't the style of a swordsman. This was the reason why Lu Xiaoyi had flown all the way here and entered the conch not far from the black hole, and quietly approached it. This kind of method of his actually had a loophole. If the opponent still had all 6 senses, he wouldn't be able to hide it for too long. But the problem was now that the bamboo hat only had 1 sense left. Lu Xiaoyi was also very puzzled. He had only seen the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, but where had the man in the bamboo hat gone? Had he come later than him and hadn't arrived yet? Or had he sensed that he was unusually close and then kept a respectful distance from him like before? It was very unlikely that he would get lost. This guy had karma with Celestial Elder Wu Hua, so it would be much easier for him to find a Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron than it was for him. Thus, his best method was to still hide in the conch and pretend to be a natural spirit treasure that had developed spiritual sense to challenge the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. There were also 2 advantages. He could see if the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron really had the remnant consciousness of Celestial Elder Wu Hua. Also, he thought that the bamboo hat might be lying in ambush somewhere. Chapter 1998. The battle at the black hole of the reflecting mirror proceeded in such a strange manner. Both sides were wary of each other. Actually, what they were truly worried about was not the other party. A second severance would not be worried about a first severance, and a swordsman would not be worried about a technique cultivator. What they were truly worried about was the possible remnant consciousness of deity Wu Hua. No one knew how much power the remnant consciousness of an immortal could unleash. There were too many influencing factors, which was the main reason why the 2 of them were acting so sneakily. Just to force out the remnant soul of immortal wuhua. It wouldn't be appropriate for a human to appear rashly for this purpose, and it would be best for them to create the illusion that two spiritual treasures were fighting against each other. This was the choice made by the two apex half-fairies without prior consultation, because they knew very well that once the remnant soul awoke, they would definitely be exposed. What they wanted to capture was the moment the remnant soul awoke. The process was that the consciousness of the immortal elder's remnant soul had lost its perception of the outside world in a deep slumber. There was only one way to force it to wake up: the leap 8 heavens cauldron. As long as the wuhua remnant soul woke up, the two half-immortals would immediately know the truth about leap 8. Half of the Heaven's Eyes mission would be completed, and the next step would be to solve the problem. As for whether the remnant soul would discover them at this time, it was no longer important. In any case, they would enter the real battle, so what difference did it make whether they knew or not? With this goal in mind, whether it was Bamboo Hat, who came first, or Lu Xiaoyi, who came later, they were all very willing to see the Kong Shun FA Conch board reverse its disadvantage and gradually gain the upper hand. The Bamboo Hat quietly watched this Dao realm battle between Khanate spirit treasures. He allowed the situation to slowly shift in the empty god spell Conch's favor. No matter which side won, he would achieve one of his goals. If the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron was defeated, the remnant soul of immortal wuhua would be forced out. Perhaps the swordsman was the one forced out after the empty god Conch was defeated, but in comparison, he actually hoped that Conch would fail more often than not. His intuition told him that this living first-step half-immortal was a much greater threat than the dead immortal wuhua. This process was very slow. When it came to the Dao realm, it wasn't as straightforward as a knife or spear. It was a slow process. He wanted to speed up the process. There was no other reason. As the incarnation of a Dao realm cultivator, he was the fastest to be sucked out by the black hole. Khanate numinous treasures were not afraid of being extracted. Humans couldn't do it, no matter what form they existed in, whether it was the normal physical form, the spiritual form, or his current Dao state form. Under the rules, no one was spared. His body was a precious artifact, so if he lost his body, he would lose it even faster. This was not beneficial to a protracted battle. The two Khanate numinous treasures did not need to be delayed for too long. In just a dozen years, he would have no choice but to scram on his own. But for a numinous treasure, wouldn't it be normal to fight for hundreds or thousands of years? Some of the older ones were tens of millions of years old. He had to add some ingredients to both sides of the spirit treasures. Otherwise, there would be no end to this. The Bamboo had already made up his mind. He would not participate in the battle for the time being, but if he played a little trick, Lu Xiaoyi had similar worries. His energy was also being sucked out at any time in the empty divine magic conch. Under such a situation, he was not worried about the Bamboo Hat, because as long as this guy was nearby, he would not be able to escape the black hole suction. Just like him, he would be weakened all the time. What he was worried about was the remnant soul of the immortal elder in the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. Once it appeared, would he still have the ability to control it? There was no time to confirm that there was indeed a remnant soul in the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron before running out of the reflection mirror to recover his cultivation. It would take more than 5 years. How could Leap 8 still stay here to be killed? He had to solve it on the spot after discovering it. He could only speed up the battle between the two Khanate numinous treasures. He couldn't do it himself. Now, controlling the empty divine magic conch to use the origin Dao realm was his limit. If he exerted more influence, it would expose the fact that the conch was controlled by a human. So, he had to find a third party to speed up. The reflection mirror was spacious. Where could there be a third party? Except for those endless resentment spiritual bodies. The two Khanate numinous treasures were facing each other, and the battle between them was controlled in the inner space of the Khanate numinous treasures. This space could be very big or very small. It was the space of the Khanate numinous treasures. Because they instinctively did not want to attract the attention of the resentment spiritual bodies outside, they were very careful in controlling their battle. However, The leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron went from being suppressed to being balanced, and now began to show signs of weakening. Even the Khanate numinous treasures were unwilling to accept such a result. They could accept being defeated by a human, but it was very difficult to accept being defeated by their own kind. It was a very strange mentality. When a mentality changed, the control of the Tao realm would also change. When the heart was not pure, the Tao realm would definitely be out of tune. In a sudden change in the 5 Grand Tao realm, the leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron made such a mistake. Although it did not cause a sudden change in the situation, it accidentally caused a leak outside the Tao realm. If this leak was in the spacious void of the universe, it would not be a big deal. However, near the black hole, it immediately attracted the attention of countless resentment spiritual bodies. It was like throwing bait into a fishing pond, and all the fish swarmed over. What surrounded them was not only the leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron, but also the empty divine magic conch. Once the Tao realm leaked, the leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's secret space opened, and then the secret space of the empty divine magic conch. Once this opening opened, it could no longer be closed unless the spiritual bodies that had broken into the secret space were eliminated first. However, to eliminate them, one would have to divide the power of the Tao realm, which would put one in a disadvantageous position in the battle against the opponent's numinous treasures, a series of chain reactions. When an unexpected situation occurred, the difference between numinous treasures and humans became apparent. Human cultivators would instantly weigh the situation and quickly make the most appropriate response. However, numinous treasures were not. They had just developed spiritual intelligence and were inexperienced. So how could they be quick-witted? With a slight hesitation, the spiritual bodies, which did not have a physical body, rushed in very quickly and immediately occupied the secret space of the 2 numinous treasures. At this moment, the battle had already turned into several sides. The leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron, the empty divine magic conch, Lu Xiaoyi, the bamboo hat, the resentment spiritual bodies, and the remnant soul of an immortal that could awaken at any time. It seemed that the situation was becoming more and more complicated. Lu Xiaoyi was very vigilant, because the mistake of the moistened 8 Heaven's Cauldron this time was very unusual. Although there was no problem in using the Tao realm, it seemed to be full of the cunning of humans. How could an innate numinous treasure that had just developed spiritual intelligence have such deep thoughts? He couldn't help but think of the worst, because in this world of deceit and deception, anything could happen. Chapter 1999. Once the resentment spiritual bodies joined the fray, the way of battle changed again. Because this was the inner space of the innate spiritual treasure, only the level of the Tao state could be compared here. It did not support the attacking methods of humans. Every resentment spirit body was a blight realm cultivator in their previous life. Regardless of their level, they were all proficient in the Tao realm. Furthermore, they were all varied and all-encompassing. But because they were just a bunch of stubbornness, the way they displayed their Tao states was very messy, incomplete, stubborn, and lacking in variety. The Tao state attack of a spiritual body was not surprising. But if there were tens of thousands of spiritual bodies causing trouble, it would become a messy battle. The balance was instantly disrupted. The first thing the 2 innate spiritual treasures had to deal with were these disregarding resentment spiritual bodies. If they ignored them, it was very likely that their Tao states would be fundamentally affected. The spiritual treasure's way of dealing with this was to break it down by separating the resentment spiritual body's stubbornness from their Tao state abilities. They would erase their Tao state abilities. Only pure resentment would be left, and they would not be able to stir up trouble. This was a brilliant method of breaking it down. It was limited to the resentment spiritual bodies, which did not have a physical body to support them. The body was a treasure, while the energy was nothingness. Lu Xiaoyi could do this too, but he did not because it was too troublesome. However, The innate spiritual treasures adhered to the inherent characteristics of their race and did not want to be too involved in human disputes. Thus, they used this method. The resentment was still there, but the abilities were gone. Since it was not completely erased, it would not be involved. It was a little too careful, but this was the principle of the spiritual treasures. This principle ensured that even if their combat power was limited, they would still become an important part of the cultivation world. There was a reason for this. Lu Xiaoyi and the bamboo hat did not attack again. Instead, they shrank to the side and quietly observed the changes. It had to be admitted that they were innate spiritual treasures after all. They had their instincts, and it was only by relying on these instincts that the resentment spiritual bodies invaded the inner space of the spiritual treasures on a large scale for a period of time, that they slowly achieved a balance against the invaders. This was just the beginning. They would first block them, then balance them, and finally expel them. In the inner space of the spiritual treasures were the true masters. Their abilities could be unleashed to the greatest extent here. The entire decomposition process could barely be considered efficient, and they even had the time to compare notes with each other. As a large number of resentment spirits were destroyed here, their Tao realm abilities were assimilated and wiped out, leaving behind only endless resentment, pure resentment. Resentment was made up of two parts, the past and the future of a cultivator. A normal half-immortal should have a past, present, and future in a body. However, since the person had died, the present was obviously not there. Although the present was made up of two parts, the past was actually very thin and disorderly. It was impossible to identify it. The reason why they existed was because of the so-called resentment, or in other words, obsession. This was the reason why they were able to condense and not dissipate, even after becoming spiritual energy. What obsession? Of course, it was the obsession to become an immortal. In other words, in the eyes of Lu Xiaoyi and the bamboo hat, what was floating in the secret space of the spiritual treasure were more and more pure future obsessions of the blight state. They were the future superego of every half-immortal. There were all kinds of strange things. Some had great ambitions, some had small ambitions, some had strange ambitions, and of course there were also evil ambitions. In a situation where the Tao realm competition between the spiritual treasures was not intense, Lu Xiaoyi could not intervene. Naturally, he placed his attention on the future superego of these half-immortal great cultivators. If it was another time or another place, he would not have the opportunity to come into contact with so many examples. However, in this place, the examples were increasing under the attack of the spiritual treasures, gradually forming a large number of data. He was a person who was good at summarizing. At first, he was still in the mood of watching a show, but as he watched, his expression became serious. He found a certain pattern among them. These cultivators had sketched out their ambitions for the future, secretly following some kind of law. Ancient cultivation was a very important process for the past, present, and future. It was also the construction of one's past, present, and future that was often mentioned in the cultivation world. Cultivators in the Blight realm also had divine splits, but their divine splits of the past and future did not affect their achievement of Yang Spirit. As long as they split their divine splits, they could advance to Yang Spirit. However, if they wanted to hide their past and future, they still needed to split their divine splits of the past and future. Among them, the so-called divine splits of the past and future was a great ambition to build one's future. Did you want to build a Daluo golden immortal, a genuine immortal, or a human immortal? It all depended on the personal ambition of the cultivator, or whether they were willing to spend a lot of time on the construction of the divine splits of the past and future. By observing these resentful spirit bodies, Lu Xiaoyi could clearly see what great ambition these dead cultivators had in the beginning. And how did he construct his future target ability? In fact, he understood that the construction of the past and future of these resentful spirit bodies was meaningless, because everyone's past was different. However, if he understood the dream of the future, then all cultivators had something in common. This came from the yearning in everyone's heart for the immortal realm. Lu Xiaoyi discovered a secret. It was a secret that he would never have discovered if he had not come to such a dead space, if he had not fallen to such a state, if he had not observed and dissected the resentful spirit bodies. This was an inference based on large amounts of data, because no one could read a large amount of other people's divine splits. This thing was hidden in everyone's mind, and was unique and would never be mentioned to others. The divine splits of the past and future was a cultivator's great ambition. It was a comprehensive plan used to describe the height one wanted to reach in the future. It included many aspects, and one of the most important aspects was the rationality of one's ability. For example, if one's great ambition was to become a Daluo Golden Immortal, then the words Daluo Golden Immortal alone could not represent everything. A framework had to be built, a framework that could accommodate all the abilities one would possess after becoming an immortal. When one truly became an immortal, one's abilities would fluctuate within the limits of this framework. This was a divine splits that relied purely on one's imagination. It was a divine splits of the system of abilities. It was a system structure that had to be reviewed by the heavenly axiom and tacitly approved by the heavenly axiom. In reality, cultivators were often very ambitious. They were always a little whimsical when it came to the construction of their divine splits. It was unrealistic. Simply put, they were indulging in fantasy and wanted to swallow a fatty in one gulp. Even a great ambition had a limit. If one's great ambition was to reshape the universe, replace the heavenly axiom, and destroy the world, then such an unreliable ambition would naturally not be approved by the heavenly axiom. Naturally, one would never have the opportunity to become an immortal. Chapter 2000. Generally speaking, in the cultivation world of the universe, there were very few cultivators who did not know their limits. Self-knowledge was a necessary quality. Most of the cultivators still had a sense of propriety. They would control their ambitions within a reasonable range in order to achieve their ultimate goal of becoming an immortal. The difficulty was that in the cultivation world, there was no orthodoxy, inheritance, or ancient book that could describe the immortals or even the framework of the Daluo Golden Immortal's abilities. There was no teaching of master and disciple, no writing, and no spreading to outsiders. These were the rules of the Four Saints' Heaven. In this way, the construction of the avatar of the superego was really diverse. Each had their own unique and wonderful ideas. Among them, there was no lack of whimsical and imaginative ideas. The construction of the avatar of the superego by most of these cultivators was destined to fail the inspection of the heavenly axiom. This was also the real reason why most of the half-immortals could never take the last step. From this point of view, the construction of the superego was far more important than Lu Xiaoyi had imagined. It was not as dispensable as he had originally thought. Whether it was a golden immortal or a true immortal, it was fine to just make a perfunctory routine. The past, the present, and the future were all equally important. He had reorganized his past in the odd righteous Pure Land. Now, he was starting to re-examine his future in the wall of mirrors. It was as if there was someone guiding him in the dark. Every cultivator, in the process of cultivation, would always have countless benefactors like this. They might not all have good intentions, but at the most appropriate time, they would push you to the most appropriate place. Fortune and misfortune came together. How could there be gains and losses? However, there was one thing. The re-examination of the past and the future had given him a more solid foundation. The construction of the past self was a process of constantly affirming oneself. If one did not even acknowledge their own past, how could there be a cultivation future to speak of? The construction of the present self was a process of correctly understanding oneself. It was a process of not boasting and not feeling inferior. Only when a cultivator understood himself could he understand the world. Both of these were the foundation. They were both laying a foundation and burying a stake. However, how high a cultivator's future achievement was, in fact, dependent on the superego in the future. How high should he position himself so that he would have a wide space to prove himself without sacrificing his potential? A simple analogy was like building a building. Your past couldn't be changed now, and it was already set in stone. It was like the pile had been laid and the foundation had been built. Then, according to the depth of a cultivator's foundation, the strength, the load-bearing capacity of the ground, and other factors, the heavenly Tao would automatically default to a height that one could reach after becoming an immortal. For example, Lu Xiaoyi. With the firmness of his foundation, the way of heaven might tacitly agree that he would be at the height of a human immortal after building the 10th floor of the building. At the 30th floor, he would be at the height of a true immortal. At the 60th floor, he would be at the height of a golden immortal. At the 100th floor, he would be at the height of a golden immortal. Therefore, he had to make a grand wish. If he made the wish to be a Daluo golden immortal, then his spirit's separation of superego structure could not exceed 100 levels. If it exceeded that, then it would be a waste of the wish. The person himself would not know it, but he would never be able to take that step because his grand wish did not match his foundation. By analogy, if he made a grand wish to be a golden immortal, then his spirit's separation of superego structure could not exceed 60 levels. If he made a true immortal wish, his structure could not exceed 30 levels. If he made a mortal immortal wish, his structure could not exceed 10 levels. No one would teach you all these things, and no one would be able to teach you. It was all up to you to figure it out. Those who felt good about themselves and made their grand wishes incomparably lofty were cutting off their own path to Tao. Those who were too cautious, careful, and did not dare to take a step beyond the minefield, and suppressed their grand wishes too low were purely limiting their ability after becoming a celestial. If there were two half-immortals who made a wish to be a Daluo golden immortal, according to their respective foundations, they could build a 100-floor building. One of them would aim to build a 90-floor building, while the other would prudently build a 70-floor building. Then, when they finally stepped into the ranks of Daluo sword immortals, the former's ability and potential would be much higher than the latter's, and he would be able to beat the latter. This was the evil consequence of making a grand wish to be a greater immortal. For a cultivator to become a celestial, taking the crucial step to become a celestial from a mortal was an extremely complicated and systematic project. Many people here emphasized on the so-called perception, fate, general trend, and other illusory things. In fact, it was the feeling of being weak and unable to control one's own body. Among them, most cultivators could perfectly achieve the ego and ego. The key was that countless cultivators were stuck in the structure of the greater immortal. There were not many cultivators who truly understood this principle. Half-immortals usually paid more attention to their own present and past. They believed that the future was illusory and vague, so why would they waste a huge amount of effort to do such a useless thing? Therefore, they did not know where they went wrong. They could only attribute it to fate. In fact, it was just an excuse that did not seek to understand. However, these talented cultivators could not be blamed for this, because they would never be able to compare the difference between two people's grand wishes. Among the secrets of a cultivator, regardless of whether it was the ego, or greater immortal, they were all the most secretive things of a cultivator. Moreover, it was impossible to express it through words. It was simply incomparable. Therefore, after millions of years in the world of cultivation, the cultivators were still groping about on their own, without any experience or precedence. It was under such circumstances that Lu Xiaoyi obtained the data regarding the construction of the future superego by chance. When the data accumulated to a certain extent, the pattern within it would naturally surface. None of these secrets had ever been passed down to the mortal world. Whether it was the Xianyuan sword sect, the three pure ones, the supreme exquisite Zhou, Xian heaven's choice, or any of the orthodoxies that Lu Xiaoyi had come into contact with, including those who were close to him, including the crow ancestor in the sword Dao steel, and so on. This could only mean one thing. When one truly understood the truth, one could only reflect on it in one's heart and could not share it with others through any means. Just like him now. The construction of the superego not only determined the threshold for a cultivator to become an immortal, it also determined the height that a cultivator could reach in the future. Simply put, a cultivator must not exceed the height that their foundation determined in the future. They must try their best to open up the space of their own abilities. If one had the ability to build a 100-story building, then if one wished to reach the 99th story, that would be the maximum limit of one's own potential. This was the world of cultivation. There was no room for mistakes. One could only approach the correct answer through continuous testing. Resentment and obsession. They could forget everything, but they could not forget their own desire for the dream in their heart. The idea of the future superego in their heart was the biggest cornerstone of their existence. Chapter 2001. Lu Xiaoyi found a trace of regularity in such a large amount of data. This regularity, in a language of the cultivation world, was called fate. To Lu Xiaoyi, fate could sometimes be explained by precise big data calculations. Maybe not all of it, but it could certainly explain a part of it. Because it was all the resentment of the cultivators in the blight state, Lu Xiaoyi had a slight understanding of the process of becoming immortal in the exterior realm. Or rather, how the man immortal behind the Jade Booklet influenced the cultivators to take the final step through the Jade Booklet to a certain extent. The unspeakable place was formed millions of years ago, among the spiritual bodies of resentment floating in the dead silent space. Some were formed millions of years ago when there was no exterior realm, and some came to the dead silent space after the appearance of the exterior realm. From a number of observations, the former was slightly more. After cultivating for more than 2,000 years, he had only heard of it and vaguely guessed it. This was the first time he faintly glimpsed the treasures of those man immortals. It was also the first time he truly began to understand what was the real control of the heavenly way and what was the selfish behavior of some people who used the heavenly way as a pretense. The high and mighty heavenly Tao should be controlling the quantity and quality of immortal ascension through the uncertainty of a cultivator's perception of the future. All those who had big eyes and small bellies, those who were arrogant, those who were unrealistic, and those who did not know their own limits would be stopped outside this barrier. Even until death, they would not understand why they could not take that last step, even though they had worked hard to cultivate, had a solid foundation, and worked hard to cultivate. When the half-immortals came to the exterior realm, the man-immortals could avoid the inspection of the heavenly way through the Jade Booklet. To a certain extent, it provided convenience for certain groups of cultivators to cheat. The specific implementation tool was the wordless heavenly steel. Lu Xiaoyi had passed by the wordless heavenly steel once, when he was an enforcer of the exterior realm. Out of curiosity, he had also gone in to demonstrate, but he did not gain anything. It was not only him, but also the results of all the enforcers of the interior realm. He did not know whether it was targeted at the interior realm cultivators or for other reasons. However, these spiritual bodies of resentment were different. Most of them were first and second decay, so their understanding was still unclear. However, there were also some fourth and fifth decay cultivators who were proficient in this Tao. By analyzing their experience of the construction of superego and the final result, one could obtain certain things. Of course, this included the personal experience of many so-called orthodox Taoist cultivators. What they experienced in the wordless heavenly steel was different from what those unorthodox Buddhist sects experienced. To put it simply, the wordless heavenly steel could help a cultivator correct his or her future superego construction to a certain extent. It was equivalent to providing a vague template for a cultivator to correct his or her future superego construction. If a cultivator was smart enough, had good comprehension ability, and knew his or her limits, he or she would be able to understand something from it, and then change his or her own unrealistic superego construction. It was obvious that not every great cultivator would have such an opportunity. This opportunity was only given to those cultivators from certain orthodoxies, such as the Orthodox Taoist, the Orthodox Buddhist sects. In the words of the mortal world, this was a kind of back door. It was opened very discreetly, very carefully, and very strictly. It would not tell you anything clearly. If you had such qualifications but couldn't understand it, then you could only blame yourself for not having such luck. However, how could a cultivator who had reached the fifth decay be so slow? There were countless human immortals in the four sacred heavens of the immortal court. However, not every immortal of the orthodoxy had such an opportunity to support their orthodoxy. For example, the great emperor Xianyuan might not be able to interfere in the exterior realm. He might not even know that there was such a loophole in the heavenly Tao's restriction on immortal ascension. The crow ancestor, even if he was still alive, he would not care about such trivial actions. At least from the looks of it, the existence of this back door was only open for the Orthodox Taoists and Buddhists. This depended on the strength of the Taoists and Buddhists in the immortal court. It was useless to be envious. In cultivation, whether it was for an individual or an orthodoxy, it was all about strength. What made Lu Xiaoyi speechless was that ever since he became a demi-immortal, he had achieved a breakthrough in understanding the structure of the upper level in such a situation. He had relied on countless spiritual bodies, which were considered trash in the eyes of others, to wreak havoc in the main world, while he was in an inexplicable situation. He had such an experience, and so did the bamboo hat. Maybe the bamboo hat did not know what big data was, but his outstanding insights still allowed him to discover something. He sighed in his heart. Opportunities always come unexpectedly. They always catch people off guard. He had never thought that he could still get such a crucial warning in the future structure under such circumstances. Those resentful spiritual bodies did not seem so ugly and annoying anymore. They were all pitiful people. For the sake of his indelible dream, he understood a lot in his state of mind at this moment. This time, he went to the immortal past to which he rode and hoped for a new era. In a sense, his smooth sailing in the realm of great Tao wasn't a good thing at all. Cultivators needed to go through ups and downs, and in this aspect, he was lacking a lot compared to the swordsman. He rarely experienced life and death situations, and he also did not have an all-powerful moment. However, he planned to completely step onto the stage of the universe's cultivation world after taking 2 steps forward. He would no longer keep a low profile, no longer endure. This way, he would not lose his momentum when fighting with the swordsman. However, at this moment, where was the swordsman? Was he nearby? Or was he waiting for an opportunity like him in the empty divine magic conch? At the very least, he had not found any clues yet. What a cunning fellow! The battle between the 2 innate spiritual treasures became more intense after the initial results of driving away the resentful spiritual bodies. They seemed to treat how to deal with the spiritual bodies as a part of the battle. Time had dragged on for a year. Originally, this kind of battle could have lasted for hundreds or thousands of years, but the addition of the resentful spiritual bodies sped up the battle. This was the plan of the 2 human half-immortals. They could not wait for hundreds of years, so they could only drag the resentful spiritual bodies into the battle, even if it might lead to additional risks. After a year of battle, the empty divine magic conch finally gained a stable advantage. The problem now was how to expand this advantage into victory. It did not have intelligence, and everything was based on instinct. It was controlled by someone and then stimulated here. Therefore, it was not very sensitive to victory or defeat. In other words, if it won, it would not know what to do. If it lost, it would not withdraw according to the rules of the spiritual treasures. Of course, with the control of a certain human hiding in its body, all of this was not a problem. Chapter 2002. Time slowly passed. The disadvantage of the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron became more and more obvious. It became more and more difficult to support it. However, the remnant soul of immortal Wu Hua still didn't come out. 2 years had already passed. 2 years ago, the two wretched half-immortals still had time to learn something from the resentful spirit body. But now that they had finished comprehending, trouble came. Time seemed to be a little tight. Whether it was the bamboo hat or Lu Xiaoyi, their elemental energy reserves were now more than 70%, less than 80%. It sounded like a lot, but these reserves had to be used for the following battle: to deal with the remnant soul of immortal Wu Hua, to deal with each other, and to deal with the possible siege of the resentful spirit body. They also had to save some energy for the return journey, as well as the possible troubles during the return journey. They had to leave enough room for maneuver. This was the psychological quality that every cultivator must have. Under this premise, they had to take action and not continue to watch the fun. When the battle between the spiritual treasures would be decided, it would be decided by the spiritual treasures' own instincts. Although the two humans were residing in the spiritual treasures, they couldn't control the core instincts of the spiritual treasures. What they could do was to partially influence and speed up the process. This kind of participation was originally what they wanted to avoid, but as time passed, the situation changed. In order to not wait in vain, they had no choice but to withdraw. They could only take advantage of the little time they still had to exert some influence. The bamboo hat thought so he mixed in with the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's Tao realm and sped up the rhythm of change, making the Tao realm between the two sides more intense and more dangerous. Lu Xiaoyi also thought so he began to take over the control of the empty divine magic Kong's Tao realm. He tried to be more aggressive without exposing any signs of human control. Otherwise, he couldn't force out the dormant remnant soul of the immortal. In the beginning, this kind of mutual attack was still messy and disorderly. It was something that the two spiritual treasures were more instinctive. But as time passed, the attack and defense became more and more familiar. There were also Tao realm tactics and hidden cunning at this point. Whether it was Lu Xiaoyi or the bamboo hat, they already understood the fact that the other party was hiding in it. Although they didn't know what method the other party used, it must be like this. This was the intuition of a half-immortal, from suspicion to certainty. In the end, no one could hide it from the other. Even though he knew, he still had to put on an act, especially when he was serious. Under the efforts of the two, the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's decline expanded, but it was also because of this expansion that the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's defense became even stronger after being shrunk to a certain range. On the other hand, the coverage of the empty divine magic conch took up most of the secret space inside the spirit treasure, which meant that it had to deal with more and more resentful spirits. As a result, it became harder and harder to expand the advantage. The resentment of the two human half-immortal realm cultivators, which they had lured into the spiritual body of resentment, had achieved its initial effect, but in the end, it had become an obstacle to the outcome of the battle. This was beyond their expectations. Time seemed to be running out, forcing the two half-immortals into a situation where they had no choice but to make a choice. Before this, the two of them had strictly followed the instructions of the heavenly eye. They had to first discover and distinguish the heavenly eye before making a decision. But now that he realized that it would take too long to distinguish, he had no choice but to consider another method: kill while distinguishing. He presupposed that the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron had the consciousness of the immortal's remnant soul, and during the process of erasing it, he would seek the truth. Just when the two of them were still weighing the pros and cons of doing this, the situation suddenly changed. The bamboo hat instantly lost its influence on the Leap 8 Heaven's Cauldron's Tao, and the divine magic conch, controlled by Lu Xiaoyi, was retreating. Under the sudden counterattack of the Leap Earth Great Tao, it had no room to fight back. The two of them were very smart. The bamboo hat hid and didn't move, while Lu Xiaoyi let nature take its course. He watched as the leap earth great Tao suppressed the divine magic conch in a flash, and at the same time wiped out all the resentful spirits that had invaded the spirit treasure space. The two of them actually didn't care about this result. They didn't care about which of the two innate spirit treasures would be able to suppress the other. What they cared about was when the immortal's remnant soul would come out. Now that the remnant soul had come out, it was the key to the problem. No one could use the Tao like this. This was an ability unique to immortals. Even if it was just a strand of remnant soul, the power of the Tao that it could exert was incomparable to that of a half-immortal. This was the hidden meaning of the two of them. If one wanted to find the remnant soul of an immortal, the best helper would be a resentful spirit body. Just like fireflies to lights, they were extremely curious about everything about the immortals. This was also their lifelong obsession. The moment the remnant soul of immortal Wu Hua appeared, it swept away these resentful spirits. It was because it didn't get tired of these spirits. After it was done, the spirit treasure's secret space was closed. Only then could there be a relatively quiet environment to settle some things. A deep and slightly tired consciousness came. Cultivating immortality in this life. Even if I die, I won't be able to rest in peace. You two little friends are from the heavenly eyes, right? You're really haunting me. The bamboo hat no longer remained silent. Senior, I'm sorry. We can't go against the orders of our superiors. We have no choice. The consciousness was very clear. Well, little guy, you seem to have some karma with me. Is that why they sent you here? The bamboo hat didn't deny it. Thanks to Senior's immortal work, Junior has obtained something in the interior heavenly realm. I'm here to settle this karma. If Senior has any wishes, feel free to tell Junior. Junior will definitely not let you down. And then send me on my way. The consciousness laughed, but it wasn't angry or sad, because this was originally a part of the cultivation world. With millions of years of life, what couldn't it see through? They were just two lackeys who were ordered by others. He didn't even have the interest to resist. Even if he used his remaining understanding to eliminate these two juniors through the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron, what could he do? Would he be safe? Once he was targeted by the immortal court, unless he completely erased all traces of his existence in the universe, there would be endless troubles. He was just a remnant soul now. How could he resist? Of course, he was no stranger to the Heavenly Eyes. He knew that these two people from the Heavenly Eyes sect came to give him a message that the immortal court already knew of his existence. Next, he should just end it himself so that everyone wouldn't lose face. The problem wasn't whether these two half-immortals could eliminate him. The problem was that he had no way to escape now, no trace to escape. In heaven and earth, there was no place for him to hide. This was a rule that existed since the beginning of the cultivation world. While geese leave traces, people leave no sound. Otherwise, the entire cultivation world would be dominated by a group of fixed existences sooner or later. There would never be a new power, and it would always be the same group of souls. The old wine would be replaced with a new bottle, and the old soup would be replaced with the same medicine. He understood all of this, but there was a breath that made him draw a trace of his real spirit into the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron when he died. He knew that doing so was useless. It was just to express the turbid breath in his heart. Chapter 2003. A remnant soul, as the name implied, was a soul that was incomplete, and fragmented. For low-realm cultivators, their remnant souls didn't have any rationality. Just like the countless resentful spirit bodies on the illuminating realm wall, they could also be considered a type of remnant soul. Remnant meant incomplete. The question was, which part was incomplete? Was it the thoughts? Was it understanding? Was it knowledge and experience? This point, from the expression of immortal Wu Hua's consciousness, couldn't be seen. His performance was very normal, as if he was a true immortal. His thoughts were clear, his reactions were sharp, and his grasp of the Tao realm was also very strong. Should an immortal's remnant soul be this strong? Why haven't you said anything? We were both sent by Heaven's Eye. He had karma with me because of the interior realm sky. What is your reason? Immortal Wu Hua's consciousness asked another ant. Lu Xiaoyi appeared very honest. Heaven's Eye has tens of millions of cultivators under its command. I'm only one of them. You ask me why I came? I also don't know. He is the master. I am the supplement. And my main task is to supervise and collect the corpse. Immortal Wu Hua was very curious. Supervise? Supervise what? What's there to supervise? Lu Xiaoyi said bitterly. And if you reach some agreement, some exchange of benefits, Immortal Wu Hua said very wisely. You mean you need to share? Lu Xiaoyi said confidently. Of course. Immortal Wu Hua asked. Then I want to know, what do you hope to obtain? Cultivation method? Secret technique? Resources? Or the secret to becoming an immortal? Lu Xiaoyi was bargaining with Immortal Wu Hua, while the bamboo hat was nervously searching for the hiding place of the immortal's consciousness. Because Lu Xiaoyi was suspicious, he was also suspicious. A remnant soul. What kind of nature did it have to have such a clear consciousness, clear memories of the past, quick thinking, and able to control the Tao realm so easily? What if it wasn't just a remnant soul, but a corpse? An evil corpse? A good corpse? This was what the bamboo hat was most worried about. Right now, he had transformed into a Tao realm and merged into the Leap 8 Heavens Cauldron. This was the best place to find traces of it. He had to find it, destroy him. No matter how normal Immortal Wu Hua's consciousness appeared, it was like an old grandpa who had seen through cultivation. The more normal it was, the more terrifying it made him feel. He wondered if the swordsman felt the same way. However, he knew that the swordsman was still spouting nonsense at a time like this. There must be a reason behind this. He had to assume that the swordsman was as sharp as he was. Perhaps the two of them had their own thoughts before, but now they had to stand together because the Immortal Wu Hua's remnant soul might be in the worst situation. Cultivation required one to have their own ideals. But before he stood up, he was very clear about where everything he had came from. Therefore, Heaven's Eye's mission must be carried out thoroughly. Moreover, because he was comprehending the Tao in the interior realm, he was involved with this immortal. So he had to separate them. If this was really a good corpse and an evil corpse, then it would definitely affect his future. At this moment, he sincerely hoped for the swordsman's support. Why are you doing this? Wouldn't it be better to end everything once and for all? Even if he stayed, it wouldn't change anything. It was a futile struggle. Leave quickly, so we won't have to worry. Immortal Wu Hua's consciousness was ancient. How can I not know this? But the change of an era is very precious to a cultivator. I want to see. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. This reason doesn't hold. People shouldn't look at a future that doesn't belong to them. Just like how mortals shouldn't think about seeing the end of this dynasty, whether or not their family will continue. Once you've seen it, you'll definitely start thinking about other things. Even if you don't think about it now, you'll definitely think about it in the future. Think about it first, then do it. Then, because of fulfilling your wish, countless people will wipe your ass for you. That's not appropriate. Immortal Wu Hua was displeased. Are you teaching me how to do things? Lu Xiaoyi remained calm. I'm just stating a fact. We've been here, we've left, that's it. We'll leave the future to the people in the future. Immortal Wu Hua sneered. Good idea. Good ambition. You're their favorite kind of Tao protector, right? Lu Xiaoyi's answer was very simple. I'll protect everything that's worth protecting. Whether it's the high and mighty heavenly Tao or the mortal world's human Tao, I won't protect for the sake of protecting, nor will I oppose for the sake of opposing. Immortal Wu Hua's words were shocking. Then, do you know that your so-called leaving the future to the people in the future is just an unrealistic fantasy? How many high and mighty immortals have done this before, or plan to do this in the future? The reason I was caught by you today is because my ability isn't enough to conceal the secrets of heaven. Little guy, you can confidently make a move against me, but that doesn't mean you're fair. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Senior, what I can do is only within the scope of my ability. You can't just take your little actions for granted because everyone is doing them and feel wronged. Moreover, it seems like you don't have any evidence. You're just making wild guesses and finding excuses for yourself. That's not good. Immortal Wu Hua's consciousness was somewhat helpless. He didn't expect these half-immortals in the lower realm to be so thoroughly brainwashed. Of course, it could also be a pretense. To him, even though he knew he couldn't do it, he still did it because he wanted to expose such a shocking scam. This wasn't because he was noble. When his immortalatus was still there, he wouldn't do it. It was because he was also a member of this vested interest group. However, since the heavenly Tao had decided to give up on him, he would naturally choose to bite back. Once his Leap Earth Great Tao had a problem, he had already lost the ability to cause trouble in the lower realm while he was in the immortal court. All these years, he could only struggle bitterly in the immortal court to see if he could luckily come back from the dead. However, his efforts didn't succeed. In the immortal court, where everyone was in danger, it was impossible for any immortal to help him, because it was very likely that they would invite trouble to themselves. He could only place his hopes in the lower realm on the traces left behind by the remnant soul after the death of an immortal. He knew that this would definitely not escape the attention of the immortal court, but at least there was a possibility of exposing some darkness. Hiding in the wall of mirrors, on one hand, was to avoid the eyes of the immortal court. This was indeed a very safe place. On the other hand, there were many half-immortals of the inner and western scenic sky here, which would help him spread some sensational news. In his judgment, the Heavenly Eye, who was in charge of carrying out the mission, would send a large number of inner and western scenic sky half-immortals who were carrying out the mission at the Wall of Mirrors to deal with him. However, he didn't expect that the Heavenly Eye would only send 2 people over in the end, which made him a little disappointed. Moreover, he could see that these 2 people's willpower was very firm. They weren't people who would be swayed by hearsay. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.